up 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Matt Miller and Paul Sweeney, we are live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Also streaming live. How about that? How about that technology? You can go to youtube.com and do some of that streaming stuff. You can search Bloomberg Radio. That'll get you where you need to go. Bailey Lipschutz, he joins us here. He covers all the markets for Bloomberg News. And Bailey, what are you seeing in the marketplace today?
Technology is really what's carrying us today. Obviously, that was the group that underperformed the last 2 days on the back of Amazon's earnings beat, as Charlie mentioned, fueling a rally among technology shares. One thing that does stand out to me, Paul, you mentioned before the break Intel, which is being as a big company. Sanofi, ticker SNY, their ADRs right now down 18%, erasing $24.5 billion in market value after stunning investors with a profit warning and saying they're going to spend more on R&D. Basically that they're going to cut their financial targets for the next 2 years to speed up their pipeline. This is one of the biggest drug developers in the world. They're planning on spinning out their consumer business, a la J&J spinning out Kenvue. But that is a massive move. Worst day on record for the ADRs after that warning, which really to me stood out among kind of the vast
amount. And that's I mean, now Sanofi is a 100 billion euro company. Intel, when Paul said big company, I immediately thought, no, it's not a big company. Now, obviously, it's huge in terms of most companies. Intel is a $150 billion company. But now I think of chip makers, I think of NVIDIA, you know? And compared to NVIDIA, Intel just looks downright small, right? NVIDIA is a $1 trillion company.
And a lot of that's just recently, too. Wow,
yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, up 179%, 180% year to date. No, NVIDIA is, right?
Yes,
not
exactly.
Intel.
Exactly.
You take a look at Intel, they're up 35% year to date, and I'm rounding up.
Right.
So they still have a long way to go in terms of this AI thing.
Well, we'll talk to Intel in just a couple of minutes and get the update there.
Ed Ludlow's going to talk to him.
Yes, casually.
I wonder if he's going to put a tie on for that interview. Probably not.
You're old school. All right, Lindsay, what else you got? I mean,
Lindsay. Does Bailey look like Lindsay?
Yeah, Bailey. I was looking at a note here from
Lindsay Piazza?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is fine, Paul. Dexcom, ticker DXCM, a smaller company, but one of those that has fallen under the pressure of Ozempic concerns, ticker DXCM, right now up 13%. They operate in the diabetes space, those devices that you probably see plenty of ads for about managing insulin, blowing past Wall Street expectations. So recouping some of those losses that we've seen really hitting the stock since it hit a recent peak in July, but still right now down 33% from a July 18th high, so still underperforming vastly compared to some peers. And then you're looking at, in the energy space, Exxon and Chevron disappointing weak refining and chemical results, so seeing those among some of the more poor performers in the S&P 500. The actual worst performer, though, Enphase Energy, ticker ENPH, right now down 13.5%. This is a stock that has been absolutely battered, down more than 75% from a peak. Really just continuing to see issues in some of the solar equipment space. We've seen warnings from SolarEdge and a number of others that had been kind of casting the wave of ESG and the future of energy, and continuing to be some of the worst performers in the S&P 500.
Chevron's down considerably, right?
Look at that. It's off
5.6%.
So Chevron shareholders are not happy today. Guess who else is not happy today? Hess shareholders, because they're taking Chevron stock. And so Chevron's post-earnings sell-off shrank the value of its all-stock offer for Hess by roughly $6.5 billion. I mean, you know, taking equity risk there. And again, the Hess family, we heard John Hess, the CEO of Hess, saying, "Yeah, we're rolling all our stock into Chevron. We're all in. We're going to get a board seat." And
they've done pretty good.
They've done pretty good.
John Hess's dad,
Leon Hess,
bought a secondhand energy truck and drove it around New Jersey to kick off this business.
We don't say the great state of New Jersey?
No, I don't say
okay.
And you know, one generation later, that's a $5 billion family, buddy.
Yep.
He did pretty good.
Another stock that's moving today, Matt, that you're pay a lot of attention to, Ford down more than 9%. pulling profit forecasts on the strike impact, but also saying they're going to dial back and delay some of their EV spending just based on consumers not really spending as much. I'm interested in this big car guy.
Well, there's just not as much demand as I think a lot of these car makers expected. All of the early adopters have scratched that itch. And then the next group to hit was really rich people who wanted to value signal, right? They've already signaled their value. Their third car's already an EV, you know? So who else is left? I mean, what you've been counting on now is the federal government and maybe your state and local municipality to bribe you to buy one of these EVs, but otherwise you're not buying one. So I think Ford already had telegraphed a slight pivot towards hybrids, right? Hybrids are the answer.
Yep. All right, Bailey Lipschultz, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Good stuff there on the markets there. We're waiting just a moment. The CEO of Intel is going to be speaking with our good buddies over at Bloomberg Technology and on the TV side here. And it's really a question about tech spending here. Where are we in kind of the tech spending cycle? Where's the demand? It's all about the cloud. It's all about AI. Everybody's trying to get positioned for that, you know, kind of the next big wave in tech spending driven by AI, and Intel's trying to get their positioning too. Certainly NVIDIA was the way to play it really for, you know, all year. NVIDIA's been to trade. Now as the tech analysts take a look at this thing, they've identified a lot of other ways to play, whether it be software or hardware or the chips, actually. So anyway, let's bring you the conversation with Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger to discuss earnings and the outlook. He speaks with our Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow. Let's head over to their discussion right now.
Welcome to our Bloomberg TV and radio audiences worldwide. Shares of Intel popping today as the chipmaker predicted a return to sales growth in the fourth quarter, fueled by a rebound in the personal computer market, but also a more competitive product lineup. Joining us now is Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger. And look, Pat, there was quite a long list of things that investors cheered, right? This is the third quarter where the markets basically said, Pat, we believe you on the turnaround story. But on your to-do list, where do you think you are and what do you think you have left to do on that turnaround story?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And, you know, overall, hey, it was a great, as we say, just a clean beat and raise on all the financial metrics. But even more important was the operational performance. And, you know, as we said, hey, getting back to process leadership. And we, you know, delivered key milestones. And we still have at least another year or two to go on getting that done. But major milestones, starting to deliver foundry customers. You know, I promised one at the start of the year, and now we have 3 on our most advanced process technology, major packaging wins, and of course the product execution. You know, clean launch of the AI PC generation, but also the server business getting back to profitability ahead of schedule, and a little bit better performance there, and delivering the AI everywhere message with our accelerators, our server product line. So a really excellent quarter, and I'm just so grateful for the Intel team. It's been a journey, and we are clearly coming back.
Pat, you've talked to investors and indeed to Caroline and I about these new customers for the foundry business. When do we get names? When are you going to announce who these customers are?
Well, you know, 2 things there, Ed. One is it's not generally the practice of the foundry industry for the foundry to be declaring their customer names. So one, is not practice, and also many of the customers consider it confidential and part of their competitive advantage in how and what technologies they choose. So I can't promise names, but we're going to characterize them as best we can. And you know, as we said, these are high performance and AI customers, and we've really seen the surge of interest in using the Intel technologies and foundry for different AI offerings in the marketplace. And that's both a wafer, but also a packaging. And this idea of advanced packaging, I mean, in addition to the 3 on the wafer side, we had 2 advanced packaging customers in AI, and that revenue materializes more rapidly, and 6 more in the pipeline. So overall, a really substantial quarter. And the AI space in particular has been the customers that have seen the most enthusiasm.
Let's talk about the AI space, because the running of AI models is where you see your future. It's not all just about the foundation models. It's actually the running of them, not just the building. But Can you just relieve some of the anxiety coming from investors about a lack of clarity over data center future? And indeed, what is it that they need to hear from you? What more can you articulate that really makes it clear to them that you're going to be front and center in the AI race?
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. And, really, first let's characterize what we're talking about, this idea of creating, these frontier or foundation models as is described versus using, right, and the training and the inferencing against those models. And I sort of compare it to like weather models. Not that many people generate weather models, but a lot of people use them. And that's how we think about this next phase of AI. How do we make this inferencing or the use of the models broadly available? And that's going to be, in the client, right? We talked about the AI PC. It's going to be at the edge, right? In retail and manufacturing and supply chains. But it's also going to be in on-premise data centers. And as we've said, instead of taking my data to the cloud, I want to bring the AI to my data center where the data is already. And finally, work in the cloud. And, for the data center proper, as your question talks about, hey, we knew we were going to lose some market share here, right? Those losses happened last year, and they're sort of playing out in the marketplace. But our roadmap is strong. And we executed in the quarter on our next gen, our Gen 4 product, but did a bit better than we thought in a lot of AI use cases in this area of inferencing. The next generation, Gen 5, we're already ramping that in production, and that's going to get announced in December. But next year's products, we're already seeing great health, and we're ahead of schedule in those, and those really improve our competitiveness. And the 25 products will go into fab in the first quarter of next year. So our whole roadmap and execution has really improved, and we start to see ourselves regaining market share in 24 in that area. And I think that will be sort of the final piece of the turnaround story when, the market sees, okay, data center is back strong, they're winning in the AI space. That'll be the end of the turnaround story, and people say, okay, they did it.
Well, going back to that building, that training of data, can you talk a little about Stability AI? Of course, you've got a deal to build their AI supercomputer. Was that them really going to you for ultimately what Gaudi can provide over what NVIDIA would? Or is it that you wanted to really be sort of offering them some carrots in the situation to be able to be helping with the training of the models?
Yeah, great question. And, now with Gaudi, we're now delivering performance and benchmarks that are as good as the best in the industry. So we've gotten our performance there. There was also some of this work that, the models were created and much of the software industry was working, on the NVIDIA platform. So we had to do some of the software work to get those running on the Gaudi platform. And they're looking for more cost-effective choices and ones that are supply chain available in the industry. And as we're ramping our Gaudi product line, we're getting that software work done. They're priced more competitively. Customers are saying, wow, I can do that work and do it at a much lower power performance envelope than the alternatives, and have a much more cost-effective model training and inferencing at scale. Okay, we're seeing a real surge of interest. And as I said, we doubled our pipeline of customers this quarter, and we, like others in the industry, are now supply chain constrained, and we're racing to catch up to that demand on our Gaudi product line.
For our Bloomberg radio and television audience worldwide, we're speaking to the CEO of Intel, Pat Gelsinger. Pat, the story of this week has been chip companies entering the PC processor market on ARM architecture. How do you hold off those newcomers? Attention, for example, on Apple this coming Monday, and they have done well in that domain.
Yeah, and I think of the AI, PC as an exciting category. And this is one that we announced, we've been the first company on that, and we're now ramping our first generation AI PC products called the Core Ultra. So others are talking about what they might do in a year or 2 years. We're ramping products in the marketplace, today. We announced over 100 ISVs in our AI acceleration program, so they're coming on board. And before others have their products even shipping in the marketplace, we'll be launching our next generation, our Lunar Lake product, which we've already demonstrated for next year. And Panther Lake, our 25 product, we're sending that into fab on our leadership Intel 18A process technology in Q1. So I feel like we have a very strong roadmap. And hey, the idea of an ARM-based PC, they've always been sort of niche and low end, with the exception of Apple. And there it's not ARM, it's Apple and their ecosystem. So for the broader Windows ARM market, it's always been pretty pretty low end, right, and insignificant in the bigger context. And as long as we deliver our roadmap, I feel very confident that as others surge into the AI PC space, this is a lift to the overall PC market, and we'll be uniquely positioned to benefit from that.
Pat, going back just a second to stability in the AI supercomputer, that's kind of in the assembled component domain. But are you saying, or are you able to confirm, that's a paid relationship where stability pays you for use of Gaudi?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is a major customer, and we'll be building that with them, of course, working closely with them. But this is a paid customer relationship. We also see quite another set around our OEMs. We announced a major partnership with Dell, right, for not only Xeons, but also Gaudis as they come on-premise and their cloud offerings. We've seen a big upsurge in Gaudi interest in the Intel Developer Cloud. We had a 5x increase in the developers on our developer cloud, much of that on the Gaudi platform. And as I said, we saw well over $1 billion last quarter. We've approximately doubled that this quarter of Gaudi demand worldwide, and those are largely paid customer engagements. So overall, we're just seeing a surge of interest with Stability AI, Dell, and many others.
Pat, every earnings look to your forecast for the PC market, and you're slightly more positive than consensus in terms of literally how many PCs you think will ship around the world this year. I guess part of that is baked into your sales forecast for the current period as well. What gives you that confidence, and why is it that consumers will return to buying PCs?
Yeah, and there's probably three different factors there. One is I can say, hey, we gave this 270 million-ish PCs being sold through this year, and we said that early in the year. Many thought that we were too optimistic. Hey, we look at it today, and we're almost spot on with our accuracy on that forecast. Second, we've seen the industry, not just Intel, but the industry overall, inventory levels are now healthy. When we look at our sell-in rate versus sell-out rate, the product is selling through. I'd also say, hey, we're off to a good start in Q4. We're a couple of weeks into the quarter, and as I said on the earnings call, really good start to Q4 as well. And seasonality is a bit above in Q4 historical levels. We also have things like Windows 10 end of service coming from Microsoft. Microsoft's about to release their Copilot products. But I'd say the sizzle in the marketplace is around this AI PC, broad new use cases for the PC. And I've compared it to the Centrino moment of 20 years ago when Centrino really ushered Wi-Fi at scale into the industry. And we think that's exactly what's going to happen with the AI PC. It will be a driver of new applications and use cases for the PC and bringing a bit more excitement, a bit acceleration, more users coming into the marketplace because it's going to give significant new capabilities to PC users.
Is that what gives you your gross margin level of 60% again? Is that where the confidence comes from?
Well, to get our overall gross margins up above 60%, I need the whole business to improve, Carolyn. Obviously, we're making good progress in the PC. I also need to improve my factory network. And as we get back to leadership, we finish this super aggressive 5 nodes in 4 years. I'm churning through capital very rapidly to get back to leadership. That's a big factor. Getting the data center business healthy, going back to one of your earlier questions, another factor in getting back to our margin structures. One of the other things we did this quarter was also have great operational success on our cost-saving initiatives, and we said, we would result in $3 billion savings. We've also cleaned up the company. I've exited 10 businesses since I've been here, and now we think we're finished with that phase, and we just get focused on growing the company again to the future. So part of it's growth, part of it's this focus areas across the businesses, and part of it is just increased operational discipline. But this quarter's results, we're well on our way to accomplishing that.
And you talk of operations there, and we didn't get time to talk about it, but we know that you do indeed have operations in Israel, and we think of your own employees and your infrastructure there at this time, Pat. So thank you very much for spending some time with us and walking us through your numbers. Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger there.
All right, that was Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow sitting down and discussing Intel with Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger. They reported some numbers. Stock up big here, stock up 10% here today. Right now, let's go to Charlie Pellet, and we'll get a little bit of a reset here and move forward.
Thank you very much. And here's what's going on. Certainly Intel and Amazon helping lead the NASDAQ 100 index higher. It is up now by 1.1%. NASDAQ Composite Index up 130, up 1%. S&P, though, little change right now, up just 2 points, less than 0.1%. The Dow lower by 0.3%. Intel predicted a return to sales growth in the fourth quarter, fueled by an improving PC market and a more competitive line. And CEO Pat Gelsinger talked about the quarter and the outlook moments ago right here on Bloomberg Radio.
You know, overall, hey, it was a great, as we say, just a clean beat and raise on all the financial metrics. But even more important was the operational performance. And, as we said, hey, getting back to process leadership.
And again, Intel up 9.9%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.86%, with the 2-year right now 5.03%. Spot gold, little change, down $4 the ounce to $19.81. West Texas Intermediate crude up 1%, $84.05 a barrel. And that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio, streaming live on YouTube as well. I'm going to bring our next guest, Matt, because we got some important stuff to talk about. Barry Ritholtz, host of Masters in Business on Bloomberg Radio. He's also the Chief Executive Officer, Chief Investment Officer, and founder of Ritholtz Wealth Management.
Plus, he's a Jeep driver, which is why I thought we should bring him on, because we're going to talk about what I'm driving this week.
What are you driving this week?
A Jeep Wrangler Rubicon 392. Which is...
Does that mean anything to you, Barry?
Yeah, I actually have an old 2013 Rubicon, which, when the apocalypse comes, that's the car I'll take. Because as amusing as some of the go-fast cars that Matt and I both like, the fun thing about the Jeep is it's kind of unstoppable. I mean, it's just really, really fun.
It's so much fun to drive, and actually, I hadn't driven the Jeep for years and years when I got into the driver's seat of this beast, and it is a beast.
Those on YouTube are seeing it right now. It is awesome looking.
It is, yeah. I love the red one that they gave me in the press car, but it has a 6.4 liter V8, the same engine that's in my Challenger. So just mountains of torque and horsepower. And when I got on the freeway, I just put the pedal down and I forgot that Jeep steering, like you have to turn the steering wheel a few revolutions before the tires know that the car wants to change direction. And it's not like a normal car. So it was a little scary at first, but after a day of getting used to it, I was like, man, this is so much fun to drive. Barry, it's a different experience than driving a regular car, just in the way you sit, the way it operates, the way it rolls. Like, it's different.
Plus, it's got a drag coefficient of, I think, 100.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
It's a brick. It's a brick.
Right. It's literally that. So you need 400 horsepower. And the car that I'm driving now could not be further opposite of the design.
Right.
I have the Nismo Z.
The what?
Which is a little, it's the new version of the Z, their track Nissan Z, their track version of it with, first of all, it's very slippery. It's just a teardrop that slips through the air. And that is the polar opposite when it comes to steering. Very little input needed, very precise steering. You used to have to spend multiple six figures to get steering this good. It's shocking how much fun this car is for how relatively
I should clarify. So Barry's also test driving a car this week, and you actually have the pre-production version of the Z.
Right.
I drove the Z. We're showing pictures of the one I drove, which I absolutely fell in love with. Although I will say that part of the affair that I had with this little Nissan Z was the manual transmission.
Oh, yeah.
Which was so much fun. I mean, I thought it was easily as good as a 911.
And by the way, shout out to the courtyard of the Bloomberg Global Headquarters.
That's
in
where
New
we
York
film
City.
all our
It
cars.
makes a great spot to showcase a car.
But Barry, so you're driving the souped up version. It's really a track car, the Nismo version. What do you think of it? Do you like it?
So about 10 years ago, I had the original Nissan 370Z, and that was kind of a GT. It was a stick shift, beautiful car, a little sexier than this version, but it was a GT. It's kind of big, kind of heavy, and about 330 horsepower. This car looks much better in person than it does in the photos. It's very purpose-built. It's very focused. As much as I prefer a stick shift, this 420 horsepower version with the 9-speed dual clutch transmission, every time you step on the gas, it's like you poked a hive of angry hornets, and it's just a lot of fun. And for honestly, for normally this sort of performance, $60,000, you're looking at used cars. A new version of this, I actually took the car over to my local detail wrap shop that does car washes and wraps and things like
Ceramic
that.
coating,
The
EPF.
kids went nuts. They lost their mind. First of all, this is like there are none in the country.
Yeah, it's pre-production.
I've been very careful because I don't want to damage the only Nismo Z in the United States. But second, you get up to extra legal speeds quite rapidly, and so
the sound eggs you on. I drove that for a couple days before Barry got in it, and the one thing is the sound makes you want to go faster, no matter how fast you're going. I love the sound of the engine.
Yeah, it's angry, and it urges you to go. And it is, when you see the pictures, it kind of looks a little plain, and then you see it in person, and it's like, oh, this is really a very handsome car. I found it very planted and very not a punishing ride. Typically a track car, you feel the lines on the highway. This, I drove home in bumper-to-bumper traffic from New York City for about an hour and a half, and it was not uncomfortable. You put it in standard mode, in regular mode, and it's sort of sedate. And then you put it into sport or sport plus, and, you awaken the demons within. It's a lot of car, and it's a lot of car for the money.
Yeah, so the Nissan Z, I think we can agree, is a great bargain. And I think it's a Porsche Cayman competitor easy, even though the engine's in the front, not in the middle.
By the way, they describe it more as a Mustang or a Camaro Challenger.
It's a race car. It's not a muscle car, And those I know have evolved into race cars, but they're still Camaro is certainly still a muscle car.
Very much so.
But I want to point out, though, Barry, that the Jeep, on the other hand, it is not a bargain in terms of the price. So the Jeep Wrangler Rubicon 392, $93,000 to start. That's before a delivery fee.
That's not a typical Jeep buyer, is it?
It's so expensive. And what I wanted to ask you about, Barry, what do you think about this inflation, which, by the way, it's not going to turn around, but Jeep, to me, it's another level on the kind of new car price inflation that we've seen. They're trying to do something, I feel like, from Stellantis headquarters. They're trying to make Jeep into a luxury brand.
So, after the pandemic, when you went out and looked at various sports cars, Ferraris, Porsches, things like that, what you ended up having is used cars were going for the same or more than new cars. Very much a pandemic related event. But go back to the 10, 15 years before the pandemic, you look at a brand new 2014 Jeep Rubicon, gussied up about 40 grand. You look at a 1-year-old Jeep Rubicon, about 40 grand. So Jeeps are notorious for holding their value. And this isn't, you want a GT3 911, they only make so many of them. They're cranking out a lot of Jeeps. And despite that, even before the pandemic, they weren't easy to get. There were no discounts to be found. There are no bargains in the used car lots of Jeeps. So we'll see if the new Bronco and some of the other competitors are going to take a little bit of market share away from them, and maybe the prices will shift. But that was always shocking. My 2013 Rubicon, I'm comfortable buying a salvage title. I don't recommend people buy a salvage title. But it was a flood car. I just replaced all the electronic harnesses, and for half of what I would normally pay for a used Jeep, I got a 10,000-mile Jeep. I mean, it was orange, or it's still orange. I just had to get used to that color.
Right.
But that's the thing about Jeeps.
All right.
You know, it's a cult, and people love them.
They love it. All right, Barry. Awesome stuff. Barry Ritholtz, host of Masters in Business on Bloomberg Radio. What in the world is Matt Miller driving? He drives pretty much anything he wants, folks. Let's be honest. Let's head down to Washington, D.C., world and national news with Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul. The manhunt continues for Robert Card, the 40-year-old suspect in the mass shooting in Lewiston, Maine. Mike Sawchek is commissioner of Maine Public Safety. He says authorities have received tips they've been busy sorting through.
Our officers, our investigators, and that's investigating. I say our, I'm talking about local, county, state, federal, all of our partners, been continuing to work 530 plus tips and leads that have come in from the general public. From a number of communities, a number of different relationships.
Mike Sawchek says divers will be searching the water near a boat launch where the suspect's car was found. Richard Goddard is one of Card's neighbors.
This is his stomping grounds. He knows every inch of this like I do. You can barely walk through that area. The woods are so thick.
A large area around Lewiston remains locked down today. President Biden may be touting his economic agenda, dubbed Bidenomics, but a Bloomberg Morning Consult poll finds swing state voters believe the economy is heading in the wrong direction. 39% of respondents said the economy was their key concern, followed by 9% who say they're more concerned about immigration. The poll also found former President Trump is leading Biden in 5 of those 7 swing states. The House and Senate have grand plans next week to tackle government funding, but they may face some challenges.
Lawmakers have until November 17th to pass government funding legislation to avoid a shutdown, but some members are already talking about another stopgap measure. House Speaker Mike Johnson pitched an appropriations plan that included passage of energy and water spending this week and 3 more bills next week. But House members don't return to Washington until Wednesday. Senators, meanwhile, aim to pass their 3-bill appropriations minibus next week and will hold a hearing on a planned national security supplemental spending bill. In Washington, I'm Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
Events, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow lower, the S&P, NASDAQ, they are both higher. Amazon and Intel ripping higher. Amazon up now by 8.4%. Intel after earnings up by 10%. Wall Street taking the latest economic numbers in stride. Tech stocks are rallying after solid earnings from both Intel and Amazon. Amazon CEO Andy Jassy gave investors much of what they wanted this earnings season. Robust sales and profit growth, along with a hint that the cloud division earnings machine is regaining momentum. Poonam Goyal covers retailers for Bloomberg Intelligence, and she was a guest this morning on surveillance.
I think the two major highlights were, one, AWS came in better than expected on the guidance front, and two, the retail business is strong, with margins getting better thanks to advertising and cost efficiencies across the distribution network.
And again, we've got Amazon up now by 8.4%. By the way, you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. S&P little changed, higher by a point. The Dow lower by 162 points right now. That is a decline of just about 0.5%. Again, the Dow lower by 164. NASDAQ, though, up 118, up 0.9%. The NASDAQ 100 index, full of big names like Intel and Amazon, up now by 1%. 10-year yield 4.87%. We've got the 2-year 5.03%. Spot gold down $3.50 the ounce to $19.81, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.3%, $84.25 a barrel. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pell, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. We're also streaming live on YouTube, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. All right, this is what I'm doing, Matt. I'm buying a 30-year Treasury, 5.03%, and I'm going to the beach. I'm done.
You're going to hold to maturity.
Yes, why not? I mean, why do I have to take all that crazy risk of all this kind of stuff? But I don't know.
But why wouldn't you buy a 20-year Treasury? You get a bigger rate. If you want to hold to maturity.
What's a 20-year? I don't have that on my screen.
You just type WB and then you click on United States.
No,
and
that's
you can
too many
see.
clicks.
So 20-year maturity, a 20-year rate, 5.231%.
Oh, all right, I'll do that.
So you're getting an extra 200 basis. You're getting extra 20 basis points over the.
All right, I'll do that then. All right, I'll call him my guy.
Over the 30-year.
I have a guy. I'll call my guy. Michelle Martin, she joins us. She's president of Prosperity. That is an Eisner-Amper company. Michelle, thanks so much for joining us here. I mean, again, buy a 20-year bond, 5.2%. I'm done. But you can't really do that, can you? What are you telling your clients these days?
No, you're nice to be here today. Thanks for asking, Paul. Yeah, and you're asking the question that everyone is thinking about right now, which is, set it and forget it. And when is the last time that we've had treasuries at 5 or over 5 and money market accounts at, over 5%? It's really the silver lining in all of this higher interest rate dialogue that people are talking about. But, it's like everything else. I think we can now diversify our portfolio with much lower risk investments on the fixed income side and have a really solid foundation going forward.
So what would you recommend clients do? I mean, I feel like especially if you're getting close to retirement,
he looks at me.
Set it and forget it makes sense. Paul's never going to retire, but I look at my parents. I don't want them taking on any additional risk, and 5% is just fine.
No, you're exactly right. And at Prosperity, one of the things we're working with a lot of clients that are just entering retirement or really needing that income to make distributions from their portfolio. So fixed income should be a core part of that. There's no doubt at all. And in fact, for clients, particularly who are somewhat risk averse, we've been underweighting the equity market just because of the volatility. But you still want some exposure to equities because you're going to have a retirement these days for most people that's going to last over 30 years. So you still need an element of growth in your portfolio. It's just that bonds are actually working, and we haven't seen that in over a decade.
in
terms of the yield that they provide.
So, but how about alternatives? We were I was at an RIA conference recently, and I was surprised about how many of the advisors were saying that their clients were asking about alternative investment, whether it's private equity, private credit, hedge funds. How do you guys think about that?
Absolutely. And I would tell you, over the last couple of years, alternatives have kind of saved the day for us. You hear things about the 60-40, is it dead? And I don't think that that's the case, but we've added a sleeve of alternatives into our portfolios, about 10%. It's not a huge piece, but it was really with interest rates rising, we added some real estate, some distributions that would be created by the portfolio when bonds weren't really doing the job. And then, some structured notes or things that buffer the market volatility. Those are just really good core pieces that we've had in our portfolios at Prosperity for at least the last couple of years. And really, as we look at volatility, that's the time when alternatives truly do make sense.
What do you think about ETFs? If you want some equity exposure, or if you want a little bit more juice than just buying treasuries, mutual funds seem to be on the way out. ETFs seem to be the new investment vehicle.
ETFs can be an amazing vehicle, particularly when you're doing dollar cost averaging and entering the market. Think about it. If you had just bought the SPY 10 years ago, that was almost a set it and forget it, right? It's really done well. But diversification is really important. I do believe that active management, when we're in uncertain times like this, the active managers over the last year, 18 months have been outperforming ETFs. But I think the way we look at it is kind of a mixture. If we can't find managers that are going to outperform the market, an ETF strategy actually is the preferred way to go because of the lower cost ratio and the broad exposure.
Yeah, if you could find me somebody who's outperformed the Qs over the past 5, 10, or 15 years, I would like to talk to that woman or man because...
Absolutely. I totally agree.
So, Michelle, as I understand it, you guys are underweight the equity market. What would be a catalyst to maybe get you a little bit more aggressive there?
I think what we would like to see is just a stabilization in the interest rate environment. That does tend to affect the equity market and, quite frankly, company earnings. We've had a little bit more of a volatility in terms of what are we seeing now. Amazon just came out yesterday, and that was pretty amazing. But it's really about just seeing how much these higher interest rates are affecting company fundamentals. So we'll watch that just a little bit more. The recession that we haven't seen yet was kind of the most widely broadcast recession we've heard about. But we're just a little cautious as it relates to understanding how hot this economy is and how the higher rates are going to affect corporate earnings.
Are you guys factoring in another rate increase, or do you think perhaps the Federal Reserve, and again, we'll hear from them next week, you think the Federal Reserve is going to kind of stay pat here?
I think we're really close to the end. We may, they've talked about one more increase, but if they do, I think it'll be small. I think we're starting to see things, get somewhat muted. Consumer spending is still really strong, but inflation has shown us some improvement. So I'm really hopeful that the Fed will give this a little bit of time to work its way through. And, but I'm not someone that thinks that we're going to see rates go down again really quickly in 24. I think it's higher for longer. Going back, I've been doing this for a while now. If you go back to like 2004, it's kind of the timeline we're looking at here when we've had rates like this. They stayed steady I don't know exactly, but 3 to 5 years. So we could see that again.
Okay, very good. Hey, Michelle, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate getting some of your thoughts and analysis. Michelle Martin, she is the president of the firm. Her name is Prosperity. That is an Eisner-Amper company. We know the Eisner-Amper folks well. They've been good supporters of this program over the years. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
You got it, Paul. An import ban on certain Apple Watch models could begin on Christmas Day. It's over patented technology that measures the amount of oxygen in users' blood. Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti has that story.
The order by the U.S. International Trade Commission said that Apple's devices infringe a pair of patents owned by Massimo. The import ban and an order to stop selling any products already here will take effect in 60 days unless it's overturned by the Biden administration on public policy grounds, something that rarely happens. Apple vowed to appeal the decision.
Shares right now up about 0.3%. Intel is predicting a return to sales growth in the fourth quarter. Earlier this hour, Bloomberg spoke with CEO Pat Gelsinger, who said he was proud of the financials, but even more pleased with the company's operational performance.
Major milestones starting to deliver foundry customers. I promised one at the start of the year, and now we have 3 on our most advanced process technology, major packaging wins, and of course the product execution. Clean launch of the AI PC generation, but also the server business getting back to profitability.
Intel right now up about 9.5%. Meanwhile, Wall Street continues to embrace AI. Citigroup is planning to grant the majority of its over 40,000 coders access to generative artificial intelligence. It's part of a small pilot program that's expanding next year, as Citigroup has already formed 2 task forces to explore potential uses for the technology. More bank executives argue AI will make their staffers more efficient. Shares of Citigroup right now down about 1%. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, looking at these markets, S&P 500 off about 0.1%. The Dow off 0.6%, 200 points on the Dow Jones Industrials. NASDAQ kind of bucking the trend there, up 0.7% on the NASDAQ. Yield slightly higher, 10-year Treasury now 4.88%. WTI crude oil up 1.5%, $84.50 per barrel. Bitcoin off about 0.9%, just under $34,000 per token. Let's get some world and national news right now with Nancy Lyons down in Washington, D.C.
Thanks, Paul. A shelter-in-place order remains in effect around Lewiston, Maine, as authorities continue to search for the suspect in a mass shooting Wednesday night that killed 18 people and injured 13 others. Mike Sawchek leads the Maine Department of Public Safety. He says they'll be searching a river near where the suspect's car was found.
You're going to see some air resources that will fly over this particular area, and they're looking to see what can we clear from the air. Do I have to put divers in that particular area, or can I tell from the top, based on the current and how muddy the water is and all those other things, can I see to the very bottom here?
Sawchek says they're also doing ground searches and checking on more than 500 tips. The world is watching on the next phase in the Israel-Hamas war. Israel carried out ground raids in Gaza for a second straight night. Now the U.S. is striking targets in Syria that it says were used by Iran and its proxy groups. We talked with Bloomberg's Israel Bureau Chief Ethan Bronner in Tel Aviv.
What we can say is that these are a small pieces of evidence of the risk of a spreading conflict, of the fact that Iranian proxies around the region, not just Hamas and Gaza, are at work, and that a combined force of Israel and the United States seeking to sort of keep them in their place, as it were, as opposed to letting it get truly out of hand.
Bloomberg's Ethan Bronner in Tel Aviv. Sam Bankman-Fried, who founded cryptocurrency exchange FTX, has been testifying today in his fraud trial. He admits a lot of people got hurt when the exchange collapsed. He also admitted on the stand that when he started his crypto hedge fund, Alameda Research, he had absolutely no idea how cryptocurrencies or the blockchain technology worked. In Donald Trump's civil fraud trial, the judge today ordered Trump's daughter, Ivanka, to testify. Her father is accused of inflating his assets by billions in financial documents that were provided to banks and insurers. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Paul and Matt.
Nancy Lyons, thank you so much. We appreciate it here. Matt, tough times in the toy business, I guess. Disappointing sales forecasts from Hasbro and Mattel. The largest U.S. toy makers are adding concern that the upcoming holiday shopping season is going to be far from cheery. I mean, you know, Mattel makes the Barbie dolls and Hot Wheels cars, and Hasbro, the maker of Nerf guns, which I like, and Transformer toys, signaled this week that their key shopping period isn't looking great. Well, they were fun back in the day. I was a big Nerf basketball fan. Nerf basketball was huge. I mean, put that on the back of your door.
When I was a kid, we had, you know, in Ohio, obviously Nerf footballs. We were playing every single day after school, playing pickup football. But also, when I was a kid, we were handed guns, like pretty much replica firearms, and like shooting at each other with them. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I don't think the kids get, like, if I got my daughter a gun, even if it was just a Nerf gun that doesn't look anything like a real gun, I think my wife would have real problems with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the other hand, so the toy sales for the holiday thing is interesting because we've already seen kind of a disappointing third quarter, right? Barbie sales were up less than 10%, which shocked me because the movie was such a huge hit. Hot Wheels outsold Barbie in terms of, you know, growth quarter over quarter, even though they didn't have a movie. And everyone's worried about the holiday season, especially as the consumer looks stretched and loan payments are restarting, etc. I always say, do not count out the U.S. consumer to spend more than you expect her or him to spend, because that's just how we do.
That's how we do things here in the U.S. That's how we do things in America. All right, we'll have to see about that. S&P 500 off 0.2%. NASDAQ bucking the trend up about 0.7%. I'm going to call that Bitcoin again because Tom Keene's not here. 33,800 per token. Sound on with Joe Matthew from Washington, D.C.
Fastest show in politics.
Starts right now.
from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
U.S. fighter jets strike targets in Syria. Is this the second front? Welcome to the fastest show in politics. As American jets hit 2 facilities believed to be used by Iran's Revolutionary Guard. This as Israel conducts new raids inside Gaza. We're going to take the wide view on what could become a regional conflict if it isn't already, with James Jeffrey, the former ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, now chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center, is back with us here on Bloomberg. The new Speaker of the House says he wants to bifurcate Israeli funding. We'll have that and a lot more as well with our signature panel on this Friday. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors, are along for the hour. Let's start on Wall Street, though, as we always do, updating trading now with Charlie Pellet in New York. Hi, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Lows of the day right now. Stocks turning negative since our last update. The S&P right now down by 6 points, drop there of 0.2%. Tech shares are rallying. NASDAQ up 88 points, higher by about 0.7%. The NASDAQ 100 index full of big tech names up 114, now up by about 0.8%. Among those tech names after earnings, we do have Amazon shares rallying by 7.6%, and Intel now up by 10.1%. So the S&P lower by 6, down 0.2%. The Dow down 209, lower by 0.6%. 10-year yield 4.88%, with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.03%. Spot gold little change, down $1 the ounce. Right now, we do have an ounce of the precious metal at $19.83. West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.7%, $84.59 a barrel on WTI. Lisa Shallett is Chief Investment Officer for Wealth Management at Morgan Stanley Wealth Management. And on Bloomberg Surveillance this morning, she said there are lots of worries for investors, including the nation's capital.
Add in all the geopolitical dimensions to what's going on right now, the dimensions of dysfunction in Washington, D.C., the fact we're rolling into an election year in the U.S. where I think that the headlines and the developments are going to be extraordinarily volatile.
And you can hear more of that conversation with Lisa Shallett on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Bottom line here, stocks lower. We're on track for another losing week. In fact, stocks are now in their 3rd month of declines. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you, and welcome to the Friday edition of Bloomberg Sound On. I actually had to check a couple of times. It has been a week. At least we have a Speaker of the House to show for it. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. It's great to see you. Join us on YouTube along with the radio or the satellite. We've got the cameras lit and love to have you join us here in the studio. Go to YouTube and search Bloomberg Global News. We've got a lot to talk about here today as we begin with the situation in Israel. I really should say the Middle East, because we're talking about a regional story at this point here. The latest from Israel, as I read on the terminal, they sent troops on a limited raid into Gaza for the 2nd night running here, kind of punching holes in things, getting ready for surveilling, doing a lot of things ahead of what will likely be a ground invasion. But we're seeing headlines now on extensive bombing to the north, in northern Gaza. Phone service and internet service has completely gone down. We may be in the midst of something here that is important. Massive airstrikes underway now. As we learn as well, the U.S. was flying jets in Syria yesterday, and this is important. It's where we want to get started with Ambassador Jeffrey back with us today. F-16s flown by the United States, striking targets in eastern Syria believed to be used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard, raising great questions about the scale of this potential military conflict. He was, of course, the ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, Also, special presidential envoy for the Global Coalition to counter ISIS. He's now at the Wilson Center, where he chairs the Middle East program. Ambassador James Jeffrey, welcome back. Sir, it's good to see you. I wonder your thoughts when you hear news like this. This is not a proxy war when American jets are striking targets, is it?
Thank you for having me on, Joe. It's important to know this is as important as Ukraine, not only for the survival of a state, because that's what's in play, but secondly, the American capability all across the world. This collective security system that's been in place since 1945 produced prosperity, peace, and political freedom for much of the world. Hamas is allied with Iran and Iran's other allies, including Hezbollah, a very powerful force in southern Lebanon. The risk is if the Israelis go in on the ground, which they seem to be preparing to do, as you just said, that Iran and Hezbollah will strike Israel or possibly strike the United States, which has put forces in the region exactly to deter intervention from the outside. What we have now is low-skill shooting back and forth between the United States and Iranian surrogates in Syria and in Iraq to try to maintain a lid on this, but there's no telling where this will go.
Well, there sure isn't. Does it make you nervous when you see U.S. aircraft inside Syria, knowing that there could be Iranian involvement at any moment, never mind Iranian cooperation with Syria?
Well, we've had, of course, aircraft there for a long time fighting the Islamic State, at times attacking the Syrian government, as you know, wiping out the Wagner battalion. In Syria, which I was responsible for 2 years, is a rock and roll battle zone and always has. That's why we took targets out of Iranian surrogates in Syria. Nobody will mind. The bigger and juicier targets, of course, are in Iraq, but that's a fairly friendly government. We don't want to bomb their territory. And the most important are in Iran, but that would be an escalation. What the Biden administration is saying is that day is coming if you start killing Americans, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you, the headlines that are crossing now are potentially significant, Ambassador. The Palestinian telecom provider now says that internet service throughout the Gaza Strip has been cut off by Israeli bombardment. What does that tell you about the next phase and how soon it might begin?
I don't want to be cynical or satirical, but frankly, I'm wondering what took the Israelis so long. This is the main vehicle for Hamas to get their propaganda out. And also, frankly, to communicate with each other, of course, as we saw in the attack on Israel on the 7th of October. Hamas has very extraordinary technical and electronic capabilities. What the Israelis have been doing with this bombing, in part, is to knock that down, and that was another step today. Again, it indicates they're thinking of a ground incursion much bigger than the ones they've done so far.
Right, sending troops in and what they're referring to as a limited raid. They actually had troops and armor rolling into Gaza last night. Some thought it might be the beginning of something larger. What type of operation do you think that was? Are they actually just surveying land, looking for tunnels, or are they doing more in terms of taking out targets while they're at it?
Yeah, as a former tank commander, I recognize this doctrinally. It's called a tank raid. It is designed to, another doctrinal term, prepare the battlefield by probing enemy weak points, seeing how they react, seeing how their communications light up when you send forces in, and in general, putting them off base, because soon Hamas will get used to these Israeli raids and will be less quick to react when the big one comes.
Well, we may see more of these, I suppose, but it doesn't signify anything to you in terms of timeline, as in going in tonight or this weekend, Ambassador?
No, a very good question. First of all, as your viewers know, because everybody's following this, there are other issues. we need to get American air defense reinforcements throughout the Middle East so that we can shoot down these drones and missiles that Iran is firing at us rather than taking casualties and having to strike back. That's an escalatory, de-escalatory thing. Secondly, there's negotiations over many of the civilian hostages. There's also concerns about getting assistance to the civilian population that is in dire need in Gaza. All of those things will feed into the Israeli planning, including intelligence on Hamas and probably refinements of the plan. This will be an extremely complicated operation. Nobody would try this unless, A, you had 360,000 troops, and B, you thought your country's existence depends upon it. But that's where I believe Israel is today.
General Pat Ryder at the Pentagon says the U.S. is deploying 900 troops now to the Middle East to beef up our presence. If we've spoken already about the 2 carrier strike groups that are heading in that direction. How much are you viewing this? To what extent are you viewing this as a regional action as opposed to one specifically between Israel and Gaza, or Hamas?
Everybody in the region, including Arab leaders who talk privately, not publicly in front of their peoples, but privately, know that this is the big one. This determines whether Iran and the various terrorist surrogates of Iran will evermore dominate the region, knock out Israel, prove that the United States will not stand by its friends, and backs down in the face of Iranian threats. That's all in play now. Nobody on our side at least wanted this, but this is where we are, and there's only one way forward, which is to reinforce and be ready to respond dramatically if Iran intervenes.
Well, so with that said, when a ground operation or invasion, whatever we call it, begins against Hamas in Gaza, what will be the regional response? We've already talked about Syria. We could talk about Iran. We could even add Turkey to the conversation. What's this going to look like?
Everybody will stay out except the big question, Iran and its surrogates, particularly the most powerful Lebanese Hezbollah in southern Lebanon with 170,000 rockets and missiles pointed at Israel and tens of thousands of troops. 3 scenarios. One, the United States massive it's wanting to deter Iran and Israel defeats Hamas in Gaza, and Iran being deterred will be shown as a paper tiger. 2, Iran actually does intervene, and this huge American force
Yeah, I wish we had a better internet connection, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for the time. We'll be, I hope, blessed by the Wi-Fi gods next time we speak. James Jeffrey, the former ambassador to Iraq and Turkey. He ran the coalition, was the special presidential envoy of the coalition to defeat ISIS. And so we've been using him for perspective on this as we get closer to what appears to be a ground assault. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we assemble our panel, including Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributor, who is actually with me here in Washington. It's great to see you at the table. Rick Davis with us as well, Bloomberg Politics contributor. Great to have our signature panel together on a Friday. Every time we talk to the ambassador, it's a sobering conversation, and he's clearly thinking about something wider, and I know I was leading him in that direction. But, Jeannie, when you start seeing headlines again of U.S. jets, American flags on these jets, striking targets in Syria, this is bringing back some pretty tough memories for people already.
It absolutely is. And, you know, you can't help but think about it and talk about it, rightly so, because this is what we are seeing unfold before our eyes. And as much as the president, the administration, Republicans and Democrats alike in the U.S. would like to avoid that, I mean, containing this was the key focus of the administration's policy as soon as this horrific event happened on October 7th. And yet it looks like despite all these efforts, that is increasingly difficult to imagine they're able to do that. And so now the U.S. is going to have to respond, and that's what we are seeing. And this raises all sorts of challenges, domestic political challenges among them, but most importantly, the safety of U.S. troops on the ground and Americans living over there as this continues to spiral out of control, which is what it looks like is going to happen in just a few hours, let alone days and weeks.
I sure wonder. Rick, we spoke with retired General Wesley Clark yesterday about this, about the idea of a second or third front potentially being open already. Here's how he put it. I guess we don't have the general here, but he was essentially saying, Rick, that this is not hot, it's warm. And I wonder your thought right now as you look at this from a regional perspective.
The things we have to understand is that Iran does not completely control all these malign actors, right? I mean, like, we think of them as almost like divisions of the Iranian military, but they're not, right? They're independent political organizations. You know, they're terrorist groups that kind of like, you know, operate in somewhat of a vacuum, and both for security reasons, but also just they don't even agree with each other, you know, on what ultimately the objectives are. Some are more interested in attacking the Americans than they are the Israelis, like what's happening in Syria right now. So part of this is, I wonder, you know, with all the flare-ups that we're seeing outside of the primary conflict between Israel and Hamas, is whether or not Iran is sitting back going, holy smokes, this could really get out of control, and all of a sudden we'll get dragged in to this conflict. I mean, Iran is really good at creating problems for other people through their carve-outs, but they don't like to get their hands dirty directly. And they still have reminiscence of 1 million men being slaughtered on the battlefield with Iraq. And so, you know, having a border war is not something they particularly are interested in. So this could actually spin out of control, not just affecting us in Israel, but also it could spin out of control of what Iran has as an expectation.
Here's what General Wesley Clark said when we spoke about this yesterday.
Well, let's put it this way. They're warming it up. But I don't think the decision's been made by the Ayatollahs to really open up the northern front yet. It's just it's nuisance right now. Yeah, they're killing people, they're firing, but they haven't really committed. They want to wait and see what Israel is able to do in Gaza, whether it's so deeply enmeshed in Gaza that it can't defend itself from the north.
We only have a minute left for this part of our conversation, Jeannie, but is this your biggest worry?
It is. And, you know, the Wesley Clark is talking about they haven't made a decision. And I think my bigger fear in a lot of people's is that the decision will be made because some kind of accident, somebody gets hurt, gets injured, more than one person, American troops get you know, hurt, and that sort of spirals out of control. So questions of whether they decide or not decide, this is what the fear is that it is such a warm area, it could turn hot very quickly and people respond. And that's a huge, huge challenge.
We've got a lot more to talk about with Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, including the ask for funding for Israel. The new Speaker of the House has weighed in on this officially. He says, bifurcate the money. We'll hear from his interview with Fox News on that and a lot of other issues, whether the government's going to shut down next month. Next with Rick and Jeannie. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. It's the fastest show in politics. We'll have a lot more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
Headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg with the Dow, the S&P in the red. NASDAQ is holding on to gains, but a rebound in stocks is sputtering. We're on track for a losing week. Major benchmarks are trading near key technical levels. Big tech, though, rallying after solid earnings from both Amazon and Intel. Right now, we have got Amazon shares up by 7.1%. Intel moving higher by 9.3%. The NASDAQ 100 index, full of those big tech names, up 60. That is a gain of 0.4%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 40, higher by 0.3%. S&P lower by 20, down by 0.5%, while the Dow now down by 301 points, a decline of 0.9%. 10-year yield 4.88%, with the 2-year that's yielding 5.02%. Spot gold right now up $2 the ounce, up by about 0.1%, 1986. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.7%, 84.56 for a barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude. J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon plans to sell shares currently worth about $141 million. It will be the first such transaction since he took the helm at the Wall Street giant almost 18 years ago. Shares of J.P. Morgan Chase down now by 3.1%. Again, recapping, we're looking at a mixed Friday here. The Dow, the S&P both lower. NASDAQ higher. S&P down 19, drop there of 0.5%. 10-year yield 4.86%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We told you around this time yesterday that Hakeem Jeffries had issued a challenge to the new Speaker of the House. Yeah, Mike Johnson, that's his name. To take a shutdown off the table for the rest of the year, for the rest of this session. And I guess we got our response. Speaker Johnson sits for his first interview on Fox News. Asked about the continuing resolution that might be required to avoid a government shutdown. And the answer is yes, with conditions.
We're going forward. Chip and Byron are at the table with others. We're working through this with the ideas and trying to ensure that if another stopgap measure is required, that we do it with certain conditions. And I think there will be conditions the American people can live with and a consensus that we can build around here in the House.
Certain conditions. As we reassemble the panel with Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, I don't know what conditions we're talking about here, but if so-called Chip and Byron are writing the CR, that would be Chip Roy, Byron Donalds of the Freedom Caucus. I believe they wrote the last one, or at least were involved in the deal-making here. Is that going to look like anything Hakeem Jeffries wants to sign?
Probably not. And it's probably not going to look like anything that the Senate's going to want to sign. So you can already tell that we're going to get into a haggle between these two institutions, the Senate and the House, over what this is going to look like. My guess is that the Speaker is not going to want to create a imminent shutdown in his first month of office. And so whatever those conditions are may be more manageable than even what we saw the first time around when the first CR was being negotiated. But at least there's an expectation that there will be a CR. And I'd say that is not something I would have assumed, considering the lack of sort of fiscal experience that this Speaker has had.
Or the fact that the last guy got fired for doing that very same thing, Jeannie. What do you think of this, those certain conditions? As a Democrat, can you see the other party voting for what's going to come out here?
I thought what was interesting was he was talking about what's palatable to the American public, and that's really beside the point. This has never been about what's palatable to the American public. It's about what's palatable to the far right wing of his own caucus. They are the ones who are opposing these CRs. They are the ones who have put all these conditions on. And so that is going to be his fight.
What are the conditions? Cuts?
Well,
is the
They are going to want to make cuts. I mean, we are just talking about Israel. He wants to separate out Ukraine and Israel.
We're going to talk about that.
Yeah, the list goes on. And so what has changed? You know, maybe, just maybe, the far right has decided they want to give him some runway, to Rick's point. Maybe they want to give him a honeymoon period of sorts for the first month or 6 weeks where he doesn't face an imminent shutdown. But I don't know that we know that yet. So he faces that as his big fight. And then, of course, if he tries to do what Kevin McCarthy did for a period of time until he signed the CR, which is to, you know, hold hands with the far right, you're going to have the moderates of his caucus who are going to balk, and to your point, Democrats. Sure. And so nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed, and I wish you guys would call him by his name, MAGA Mike, the only thing has changed is the person who is sitting in this very difficult seat, who has got all of this ahead of him and who comes with almost no experience. He's never even chaired a committee.
So is a shutdown more or less likely?
You know, I think it's a little less likely, only because they may wise up and want to give him some runway room. But I'm not convinced that we've heard that from either of these two warring sides of the Republican caucus at this point.
Well, we started this hour talking about Israel, and there is a big ask for money. It's over $100 billion for Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and the border. If you listen to this show, you know that already. Speaker Johnson asked about that as well last evening, and he made it clear that he doesn't want to bring a combined piece of legislation to the floor. Here's how he put it.
I told the staff at the White House today that our consensus among House Republicans is that we need to bifurcate those issues. I agree with your assessment in Ukraine, and that's why the American people are demanding some real accountability for the use of those dollars. Now, we can't allow Vladimir Putin to prevail in Ukraine because I don't believe it would stop there, and it would probably encourage and empower China to perhaps make a move on Taiwan. We have these concerns. We're not going to abandon them, but we have a responsibility, a stewardship responsibility over the precious treasure of the American people, and we have to make sure that the White House is providing the people with some accountability for the dollars.
Rick, he just said a lot there, and I'm not sure what he means by accountability, if that's some sort of an audit or whatever that comes with the money that's allocated. But his approach here, and I know it's shared by members of his caucus, or he wouldn't be doing it, I guess, to take the Israeli money out and bring that to the floor alone, I imagine will only slow things down. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure it'll slow things down, and they'll have the Senate right on top of them with the, you know, sort of combined kit of funding that they'll have to deal with. And if they don't get onto it, they'll have to deal with a Senate bill that will be much more difficult for them to carve up. I would say, you know, as the speaker just said, you know, he's not caving to Putin, so that's reassuring. And he's saying he's for funding. In fact, he goes on in that same interview to talk about how he's not as concerned, and I'm, you know, putting words in his mouth, but to paraphrase, he's not as concerned about the money going for weapons systems, because he knows what we know, which is most of that money is spent on U.S. weapons manufacturers. He's concerned about the economic assistance, which is part of this formulation. And that has had fewer sort of strings of accountability. You know, that goes right into the Ukrainian economy. And it's necessary, almost if not equally necessary as the security aid. But the administration has been slow to sort of talk about what specifically those funds are going to be used for. And I think that's part of the message that he's sending to the White House is, you know, let's drill down on that before we just give you a blank check.
What do you think of this approach and what it will actually mean for getting help to Israel? We can treat these separately because Rick makes some very good points about Ukraine. But is this going to mean a longer wait for Israel?
It very well could. You know, there's a reason that the Biden administration and Mitch McConnell and others want to go big on this, because you're really only going to get one bite at this apple. That's why they're putting $106 billion plus in and trying to get this through. But, you know, if you just listened, as I like to do for you, Joe Matthew, to Steve Bannon's show, and you listen to Matt Gaetz go on that show and say the Mike Johnson assuming the speakership was a win for the MAGA right. It was a win for us. And so I agree with Rick that he's saying the right things last night. He is trying to be responsible with money. We agree with all of that. But that is all beside the point. If any of those folks decide they are unhappy, and if 4 of them decide they are unhappy as they did previously, we're back where we started from. So, you have to listen to what they're saying. Nothing about the structure of the position he finds himself in has changed. We've changed the person, but we haven't changed all of the environment going on there, and the environment is unhealthy, and that has to make all of us skeptical this gets through as one package.
Well, so, Rick, it sounds like the administration needs to do a better job messaging what this Ukraine money is for. General Wesley Clark talked about it yesterday. You just made reference to, American defense contractors. This is about also replenishing what we have here. Wouldn't that be a better argument than simply saying $60 billion for Ukraine?
Yeah, and I think those conversations are being had within, the walls of Congress and the White House. But again, I mean, part of President Biden's job is to convince the American public that this is important and that we are doing the right thing, because that, of course, helps reinforce his standing with Congress. I mean, if the American public are behind him, then it's a lot easier to get these recalcitrant Republicans to do the right thing on Ukraine specifically. Everybody wants to write that check for Israel and the emergency assistance and the border assistance. Those things are going to be easy. The only thing that's going to be tricky is to get a straight vote on Ukrainian assistance. And frankly, that was what I thought was so smart about combining it, because they can just get that done in one swell swoop and ride on the backs of those more popular measures.
Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature panel, with us on the Friday edition of Sound On. We've got some breaking headlines from Israel that we'll talk about, and we haven't even gotten to this yet. Joe Biden has a new challenger in, can we call it the Democratic primary? We'll have that next after a check on world and national news with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. A suspected mass shooter remains at large in Maine. Maine Public Safety Commissioner Mike Sawchuk says they'll be conducting water searches today where the suspect's car was found. And he says a shelter-in-place order remains so that everyone stays safe.
We want to make sure that we bring this individual to custody, but we got to do it right. We got to do it the safe way. Don't want to see anybody else get hurt, certainly our people and our community members. So we want to make sure that we do that right. We're not going to be rushed, but we're running right on that level, that we're going to work as hard as we can, as fast as we can, with as many resources as we can.
Almost 700 square miles of the state are under shelter-in-place orders. FTX co-founder Sam Bankman-Fried is on the stand to testify in his own defense.
Bankman-Fried began testifying at his fraud trial, saying he hoped his business would move the cryptocurrency ecosystem forward. He acknowledged some of his failures early in his testimony, saying that he made mistakes. But when his lawyer asked if he defrauded anyone, Bankman-Fried answered, "No, I did not."
That's Bloomberg's Amy Morris reporting. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
Profits, headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 is extending its drop from its July peak now to 10%. The S&P now lower by another 0.6%, down 23 points, now at 4114. S&P 500 index, as I mentioned, lower. We've got the Dow down by 1%, down 327 points. NASDAQ up, though, holding on to a gain of 33 points now, up by about 0.3%. The NASDAQ Composite Index and the NASDAQ 100 Index both advancing after earnings from Amazon and Intel. Amazon up now by 6.9%, Intel up by 9.3%. But the bottom line, S&P extending its slide from its July peak to 10%, the threshold of a so-called correction. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.85% right now, with a 2-year that is yielding 5.02%. Gold up $9.50 the ounce to $19.94, up by 0.5%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.6%, $85.37 for a barrel of WTI. There is fresh data on American consumers, and with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The government reports consumer spending posted a solid gain in September, and a measure of inflation accelerated. The University of Michigan, meantime, reports consumer sentiment dropped in October. What may it mean? Well, how's this? Inflation remains a burden for American families. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
And again, recapping 10-year yield at 4.85%. The 2-year right now, 5.02%. S&P down 20, a drop there of 0.5%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
There is another, a Democrat running for president. His name is not Gavin Newsom. I don't think Joe Biden is losing sleep over it, but the representative from Minnesota, Dean Phillips, is running. The ad is up. The exclusive interview has been had. Here's what it sounds like. You ready?
I'm Dean Phillips, and I'm running for President of the United States of America. And I'm coming to New Hampshire to answer your questions. I love New Hampshire. I spent my summers as a kid in the White Mountains going to camp. Got to canoe the Saco River, learn how to fish, learn how to shoot a gun. Got to climb the presidential range, including Mount Washington.
Got the gun reference in there. I used to go to New Hampshire as a kid. I can't imagine that really being the way I introduced myself to the nation running for president. But he had more to say when he sat down with CBS News. Here is, again, Dean Phillips.
Are you running for president? I am. I have to. I think President Biden has done a spectacular job for our country. But it's not about the past. This is an election about the future. I will not sit still. I will not be quiet in the face of numbers that are so clearly saying that we're going to be facing an emergency next November.
An emergency in a hypothetical race against Donald Trump. Let's reassemble our panel with Jeannie Shanzano at the table here in Washington and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Jeannie, are you shaking in your boots here? Is Dean Phillips the next Democratic nominee? What's he thinking?
Having climbed Mount Washington many times and spent many summers on the presidential range, excellent. I have to say I do like that introduction. I appreciate it.
I went to Six Gun City as a kid. Does that count? White Mountains?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's beautiful. That. So he knows what he's doing when he's putting that out. But, you know, there's a reason, as you said, Gavin Newsom and, you know, some of the other very popular governors who he, let's not forget, not that long ago said should consider running. There's a reason they're not running. Is because, number one, it is very, very late at this point, and number two, it's going to be difficult to get name recognition, get yourself out there against an incumbent president, and number three, I think biggest of all, is that no Democrats want to be spoilers and help Donald Trump get elected. Yeah. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons they aren't running. That said, I think Phillips has a point when he says, looking at the polls, almost 7 out of 10 Democrats are concerned about Joe Joe Biden's health, about his age, and they are looking for new leadership, particularly young people and African Americans. So he is trying to build on that. I don't think Joe Biden's worried at this point, nor should he be, but I do think it's something Democrats have to take seriously. The polls have been unswavering and unwavering. I don't think swavering is a word, but unwavering on this point about concerns about Joe Biden's ability to serve another 4 years. And he is taking that mantle and running with it.
What do you think, Rick? Should we take this campaign seriously?
You know, I don't think you can take it seriously from the point of view of Joe Biden losing the nomination. I think you can take it seriously from a Democrat, you know, who has credibility with independent voters because he's in the president's own party, criticizing the president's age, which they care about already, is probably one of the most important things that's driving their vote preference. So this is a horrible thing for Joe Biden. But they kind of set it up for themselves. I mean, this idea of bypassing Iowa, New Hampshire, and, oh, we're going to start the primary in South Carolina. I mean, this is like a gift. I mean, if he can't win a state that the president's not even on the ballot, then he should really wrap up his political career. But the bottom line is, you know, it's sort of misstep after misstep by the Biden campaign. And now they got to pay the piper, and this is not a shock that somebody would come out of there in a different generation who wants to contest this. And by the way, they are dying to get Donald Trump to be the candidate against them next November, because you look at every other matchup with people like Nikki Haley, and it's a lot worse for President Biden. So I think if they can set this table the way it is now, they'd be happy to sort of try and run. But as you've seen from our own Bloomberg polling, you know, even that is looking pretty grim from a targeted state basis, where in places like Arizona and Georgia, Donald Trump's already got a lead on the president. So it's a pretty tough fall for the president right now.
Well, Dean Phillips said in his interview with CBS, Jeannie, that he was alarmed, is the word he used, by the prospect of Donald Trump beating Joe Biden after studying polling data that compelled him to make this move. Are you alarmed when you look at the numbers now?
Very alarmed. And the Bloomberg poll showing that in those 7 swing states, Donald Trump is beating Joe Biden. In 5 of those, they are tied in 1. And
So
Biden
you do not assume Joe Biden can beat
I
Donald Trump?
do not. And I agree with Rick. It has long been the view of the Biden folks that get Trump on that ballot. In fact, the only way we can win is against Trump, because we can show him as crazy and him as, you know, unable and somebody who should not be reelected to the presidency. So let's get him on the ballot. But the danger here is be careful what you wish for, because in these matchups in this Bloomberg poll, Trump is winning. He is overperforming in those states. It is an enormous concern. And the biggest concern for Biden, putting Israel, Ukraine, everything aside, is the state of the economy. For people in their daily lives, living expenses, inflation, the price of gas, the price of groceries, and housing, mortgages. Young people can't get mortgages. Their mortgages are 7-8%, as you know. So, you know, boomers are looking at 3 and 4% because they were lucky enough to get in early. All of that bodes very poorly for the president, and they have to take that seriously, because those constituencies are critical for them to win, and they are not feeling good about where the economy is right now. It's not to say the president hasn't done some really important things, but the economy is still it, and it is not a good sign for Joe Biden.
Rick, we only have a minute left. We've talked a lot about a no labels candidate, about even Cornel West's campaign. Do you put Dean Phillips in the same category as a potential spoiler?
No, I mean, you know, I think that the reality is he'll be long gone by the time the general election occurs, and people like Cornel West and Robert Kennedy and the no labels candidates, if they have them, are going to have an actual impact on votes that would otherwise be cast for Trump or Biden. So no, he will be the sort of, you know, winter candidate, the winter soldier of the Democratic Party. And all of the, you know, sort of heroes of the Democratic Party will emerge in January and February and March to ensure that this winter soldier gets beat, just like if it was a Marvel comic.
Wow. That's brutal. Rick, thank you. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzana will have some final thoughts ahead here on the fastest show in politics. We'll hit those headlines from Israel and bring you up to date on the news with Nancy Lyons. Fast moving as always here on the radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. From Washington, this is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon plans to sell shares currently worth about $141 million. And with more on that story, here's Bloomberg's Steve Rappaport.
Charlie, it is the first such transaction since he took the helm at the Wall Street giant almost 18 years ago. According to a regulatory filing, starting next year, Dimon and his family will dispose of 1 million of the lender's shares for financial diversification and tax planning purposes. In a statement, JP Morgan said Dimon continues to believe the company's prospects are very strong and his stake in the company will remain very significant. The increase of more than 250% in JP Morgan shares during Dimon's tenure has helped turn the executive into a billionaire. Charlie?
And that's Steve Rappaport reporting JP Morgan Chase shares down 3.2%. ExxonMobil sees tight global oil supplies putting upward pressure on energy prices for at least the next few years. ExxonMobil CEO Darren Woods was interviewed on Bloomberg Radio this morning. He discussed a number of topics, including emission-reducing projects.
And so if you look at the challenges of going from carbon capture or biofuels at scale or hydrogen at scale, marrying that with requirements of storing and sequestering CO2. We are in the sweet spot of pulling all those things together and doing it at scale, which is going to be required to address the challenges out there with respect to the size of the emissions that we have to reduce.
And we've got ExxonMobil shares down by 1.6%. Chevron fell short of analysts' expectations amid weak returns from its overseas refineries. Chevron down now by 6%. Those are our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We're live from Washington, where we'll add Kaylee Lyons to the conversation coming up in just 5 minutes. Final thoughts ahead from Rick and Jeannie after we check on world and national news. Nancy Lyons has that in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Israeli defense officials say Israeli forces are expanding their activity in the Gaza Strip, specifically on underground targets. Bloomberg Sound On spoke with former U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and Albania, James Jeffries, about the growing ground war.
The risk is if the Israelis go in on the ground, which they seem to be preparing to do, Iran and Hezbollah will strike Israel, or possibly strike the United States, which has put forces in the region exactly to deter intervention from the outside.
James Jeffries says new U.S. strikes on Syria, targeting 2 facilities that were used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard, were meant as a signal to Iran to stop targeting U.S. personnel in the region. Authorities in Lewiston, Maine say they continue to follow up on more than 500 tips they've received in their search for a mass shooter who remains at large. Lewiston Police Chief David St. Pierre says they're working around the clock to find the suspect, Robert Card.
The safety of our community remains paramount. I want to assure all that a tremendous amount of law enforcement manpower, time, and effort is being utilized around the clock, literally around the clock, in every effort to apprehend the suspect as well as to safeguard this community.
St. Pierre is asking for patience from residents, saying the manhunt has a lot of moving parts. Embattled New York Congressman George Santos has pleaded not guilty to the latest set of charges against him.
The freshman Republican, who allegedly made up much of his life story before he was elected to Congress, appeared in federal court on Long Island this morning to answer to 10 additional charges. They include making false statements to the Federal Election Commission and running up unauthorized expenses on his donors' credit cards. The judge set a trial date for Santos for next September, but long before that, he'll face an expulsion vote from the House next week. Santos's fellow New York Republicans are pushing that effort now that Congress is back up and running. In Washington, I'm Nathan Hager, Bloomberg Radio.
Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Now back to you, Joe.
Right, Nancy, thanks. Love him or hate him, I think we can all agree that one of the highlights of George W. Bush's presidency was when he threw out the first pitch. And remember Game 3 of the World Series in 2001. This was as the nation was healing from 9/11. And it was a remarkable moment as he went out there.
For tonight's ceremonial first pitch. And please welcome the President of the United States.
Quick walk out there at Yankee Stadium in New York. Hit the mound and dropped it right across the plate. The place went wild. And I bring this up because he's going to do it again tonight. George W. Bush throwing out the first pitch in Game 1 of this World Series with his old team, the Texas Rangers, and Arizona, of course. Listen to the place go wild. Final thoughts from Rick and Jeannie. This is the good part of politics, right, Jeannie? And I think a lot of people will remember that moment that I'm referring to when he steps up there tonight.
That's right. And, you know, it is very nostalgic to hear that and the crowd cheering in New York, such a moment after 9/11. Yeah, I mean, and even for people who are not huge baseball fans like me, have to say, I love baseball, but don't know anything about it. But it is very moving, to your point.
Rick, that's got to be the hardest thing, right? To get a politician up there on the mound and get the ball right across the plate. That's like high-level risk.
It's a high-level risk, but George Bush is a pretty athletic guy, and he practiced quite a bit. And I was actually there. They were playing the Arizona Diamondbacks, as they will tonight. And John McCain and Rudy Giuliani were sitting together right on the front row behind a Yankee bullpen. So
amazing. It was quite a night. That must have been the loudest Yankee Stadium you ever heard, right?
That's the loudest crowd I've ever heard.
That's amazing. I love that you can share that with us. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature panel, and a great conversation on a Friday. Wow, we learned a lot this week, and we lived through it with Rick and Jeannie, and Kaylee's on the way next. Hour 2 of Sound On starts right now.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself. Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover them.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Speaker Mike Johnson says he supports a stopgap bill to avoid a government shutdown with certain conditions. Welcome to Hour 2 of Sound On. As the new speaker gives some of the first clues into his approach on spending and foreign affairs as the man who holds the gavel in an important interview that we're going to break down and discuss with Republican Congressman Tim Burchett of Tennessee. He's back with us today after a wild week in the House. Insights as well from Bloomberg politics reporter Gregory Cordy, and we'll spend some time later with Bloomberg's David Weston, the host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week, who today spent some time with a former U.S. ambassador to Israel. And all that is ahead after a look at trading. Charlie Pellet brings that to us from New York. Hi, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Joe Matthew. No doubt about it. David Weston going to be talking about another losing week for U.S. stocks. 2 in a row. We have got the Dow, the S&P in the red. NASDAQ holding on to a gain right now of 0.2%. The NASDAQ 100 index, full of big tech names like Amazon and Intel, is higher by 0.4%. Amazon after earnings up by 6.5%. Intel after earnings up now by 9.4%. A rebound in stocks sputtered with the S&P extending a slide from its July peak to 10%. That is the threshold of a so-called correction. Oil and gold rose amid the latest geopolitical developments. We got gold up 0.6% right now, $19.97 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 2.9%. 85.65 right now for a barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude. 10-year yield 4.84% with a 2-year now yielding 5.01%. Bottom line here, U.S. stocks on track for another losing week, 2 in a row. Next up for Wall Street, though, a Fed meeting next week. Ian Lingen is head of U.S. rate strategy at BMO Capital Markets.
What we know is that the Fed is going to remain restrictive for an extended period of time. Chances are that we don't get another quarter-point hike from here, certainly not next week. So 2-year yields are comfortably anchored to around 5%.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance Podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Stocks lower, S&P now down by 24 points, a decline of just about 0.6%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, Charlie, thank you. Welcome to Friday and Hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, alongside Kaylee Lines. She is with us now. We made it to the end of the week. It's good to see you. I'm just trusting myself that it is Friday because I've thought that a few times over the last couple of days. It better be indeed. At least we got a speaker. That got done. And we heard from and saw the speaker in action. He sat down with Sean Hannity, did an extended interview on Fox, in which I learned probably more about Sean Hannity's views on things than the new speaker, but that's sometimes the way it goes.
Yeah.
But we're going to talk about a couple of the breadcrumbs he left for us here, beginning with a continuing resolution, Kaylee. This is the very thing that basically got Kevin McCarthy fired.
That's correct.
A short-term bill that would keep the government from shutting down, in this case on November 17. But it sounds like there could be some strings attached to this one.
That was his suggestion. He acknowledged that he's working against a clock here. They only have about 3 weeks or so to get something done. So it does seem like a continuing resolution. Another stopgap measure is going to be what has to happen while they continue to try to pass single subject appropriations bills. And what he said was, you got Byron Donalds and Chip Roy working things out, and there's going to be conditions. We don't exactly know what those might be. The speaker last night suggested that they would be ones the American people could live with. But basically, Joe, there's going to be a catch.
That's right.
Kind.
It sounds like it. Not sure what that is. It's almost like you watched the interview. Here's
all 41 minutes of it.
We're going forward. Chip and Byron are at the table with others. We're working through this with the ideas and trying to ensure that if another stopgap measure is required, that we do it with certain conditions. And I think there will be conditions the American people can live with and a consensus that we can build around here in the House.
And so this is where we begin our conversation with Congressman Tim Burchett. He's back with us, the Republican from Tennessee's 2nd District. Congressman, it's good to see you. You're probably really glad to be home after the throes of the last weeks here in Washington, D.C. I'm sure you're glad to have a speaker, and I wonder to what extent we should read into certain conditions and what a package here might look like.
I don't know if you want to read too much into all that. The reality is that a continued resolution was originally, I believe the history of it was under an emergency situation, and then it just got abused by the swamp or whatever you want to call it, both parties. And
is this an emergency?
And I was going to say this could be an emergency. We ran up against the barrier last time, but if you remember, we took off, as we've done under Democrats and Republicans, the whole month of August and 2 weeks into September. And, and we pushed it right up against the September 30th deadline. So this is a little different. This speaker has just taken over, and obviously he's getting his feet wet up to about the top of his hairline, I guess. But but I think he's done pretty well, because yesterday he passed a very tough appropriations bill, and it got through with overwhelming Republican support, which is something you didn't see under the prior speaker. So I think, as I've stated, you got a new sheriff in town. His name's Mike Johnson, and he's doing a good job.
Indeed, and I would say he's not necessarily just getting his feet wet. He might have just been thrown right into the deep end, Congressman. As we talk about continuing resolution, which I know historically is something that, or an idea, a concept you haven't been ultra supportive of, what conditions would you need to see in order to vote yay on that bill?
Well, I'd like to see some real border security, not what the president's putting down, and more bureaucrats to allow illegal aliens to get further into our country and never show up at court, and they're just there permanently. And I'd like to see some of these single issue funding bills, things like that. I mean, just on down the line. But I think he's going about it the right approach. He's asking us his opinion, our opinion, and not telling us his opinion. And so I think that's a different style of leadership, something we're not used to. And I think and it's some honesty, too, that we're not used to.
Well, it sounds like you're going to have some conversations about the form that this takes. As he says, Chip Roy and Byron Donalds are authoring something. I don't know how soon you think you're going to see it, but there's also a supplemental budget request worth more than $100 billion coming your way from the White House. And last evening, Speaker Johnson made it clear that he does not want to address Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and the border all in one package. I'm going to let our listeners and viewers get a sense of this in his answer, Congressman, and hear your reply. Here's the Speaker.
I told the staff at the White House today that our consensus among House Republicans is that we need to bifurcate those issues. I agree with your assessment in Ukraine, and that's why the American people are demanding some real accountability for the use of those dollars. Now, we can't allow Vladimir Putin to prevail in Ukraine, because I don't believe it would stop there, and it would probably encourage and empower China to perhaps make a move on Taiwan. We have these concerns. We're not going to abandon them, but we have a responsibility, a stewardship responsibility over the precious treasure of the American people. And we have to make sure that the White House is providing the people with some accountability for the dollars.
So he said a lot there, Congressman, and I'd like to hear you speak to accountability when it comes to Ukraine, what that would look like, what kind of system can be put in place that might make you feel better about accountability and auditing maybe the money that's already been spent. But let's start with Israel. If the Republican conference, if the Speaker brings that to the floor as a standalone, knowing that the Senate, the White House don't support it that way, do you worry that that would slow down potentially money getting to Israel?
No, I don't. You know, they already have pretty much on auto check $3.8 billion that we supply. We've just sent over, hasn't been much reported, and and it's out in the public domain, so I can talk about it. But there's been 2 more of the Iron Dome implements have been sent to Israel that we had. We've got the Gerald R4 carrier group. Probably, I mean, that's the biggest. That's the biggest dog in the park. You put that thing in the Mediterranean, everybody knows it's there. Plus 6 more. Probably mercenaries on the ground everywhere. And so I think Israel knows where we are, and the last thing they really want is our military presence on the ground there, boots on the ground in Gaza, because of our rules of engagement, and their rules are totally different. Our rules of engagement got, at the end of Afghanistan, got a bunch of people killed because they wouldn't take out a bomber, a suicide bomber, and I talked to the sniper who had him in his sights twice, but was told by the war pimps at the Pentagon that he couldn't take this guy out. So Israel doesn't need that. But I think Israel knows where we are. But why would you, knowing that there's going to be an objection, why would the President of the United States allow that bill to come out with Ukraine money tied to it? Because he wants to put somebody in a political spot. And that's the only reason. We haven't been doing anything. It's been probably the most productive 20 some odd days, really, if you want to look at overall outcome, by electing Mike Johnson, our speaker. But what's the Senate been doing? They haven't been doing anything. We haven't even seen this. They haven't even sent the bill over yet. So, it's just politics as usual in Washington. Cut the BS, send 3 different bills over, send one with Ukraine, send one with border security, or so-called border security, and send one with Israel. That's all you got to do. 3 sheets of paper. And yet they want to politicize it and want to try to tie it up. They're the ones, I submit to you, they're the ones tying it up. Let's get to business. Let's cut the garbage out and do what's right for the people of Israel.
But Congressman, arguably the reason why the White House is trying to tie these together is because there is a certain resistance to continuing to fund Ukraine within your party in the House of Representatives. Are you saying if the White House were to send 3 separate packages, that Ukraine bill could pass on the House floor?
Yeah, I mean, all the Democrats would vote for it, and you probably, we had 100 and some odd votes, I think, in favor of Ukraine the last time something came through. That's stupid. Just send it over there separate. If they want to really pass it, do it separately. I would vote against Ukraine funding again, because there again, it's not our war. Show me the reason we're over there. If we're going to say that, look, we got dictators down in Central America that are abusing people. The Chinese are putting the Uyghur population in concentration camps. Why are we not going to war with China over it if we're so ethically challenged on this front? Ma'am, this is just politics.
Well, I'm not the guy with answers, but the administration says that if Vladimir Putin succeeds in Ukraine, and I know a lot of Republicans on the Hill agree with him, that it would be a national security problem for the United States and our allies in Europe. And is that part of the argument that you disagree with?
I disagree with that premise. The GDP of Russia is somewhere between France and Canada. This is a European situation. Let them decide it. Europe needs to be kicking in more money. They're not. The number 2 contributor to this whole thing in the beginning was Estonia. We were profiting off of both sides because of, and we were funding both sides of this war in the beginning because of the oil situation. This thing and the shady dealings that have been going on between them and people in Washington has been going on too long. And so eventually we'll get to the bottom of it. It'll probably be our grandkids that, a made-for-TV special or something, if TV is even around then. But it's a crooked country, and people are getting fat. I get too many reports of stuff from people that are there in Ukraine telling me that the stuff we're sending.
What about the people who are starving, who are dying? That the civilian death has been overwhelming, has it not?
What about people dying in this country because we don't have the guts to preserve our own our own border.
Well, I don't want to get into a what about conversation with you. We're just talking about Ukraine.
No, I know that, but I'm just saying, our priorities are out of whack. We put the focus on Ukraine, and yeah, it's awful, but there's stuff going on all over the world that's awful. People are starving to death in Africa. We've got these dictators down in Central America. There's people that are being brutalized in Central America, Mexico, for instance, on our borders. They're at the will of the cartels, people getting raped and murdered every day. And yet we're not doing anything about that. But we're all the way
and Congressman,
go ahead.
Congressman, there's people being killed in bowling alleys just this past week. What should the response be to yet another mass shooting in the United States?
It's a mental health issue. You've got a guy who apparently, from what I understand, got these guns. He was a reservist in our own military. There's obviously a problem there. The thing that ties in every one of these folks together is mental health issues. It's a mental health crisis. They could do it with a gun. They could do it with a knife. They could do it with an automobile. You remember one of the largest mass killings in this country, Oklahoma City, was done with ammonium nitrate fertilizer you could buy at Walmart, literally, and diesel fuel. And he killed over 100 people. And so it's just we've got a mental health issue in this country, and until we address that, this will continue. It'll just move into another avenue. We lose more people to drunk drivers than we have to mass shootings, but nobody's wanting to outlaw alcohol or cars.
All right, Congressman, well, on the subject of things that are against the law, or at least people have been accused of breaking the law, just yesterday, several of your colleagues from New York introduced an expulsion resolution for Congressman George Santos, who, of course, has been indicted on a number of counts. When that comes to the floor next week, would you vote to expel him?
Probably not, ma'am. We've got a court of law. Let's let it work. Let's let it work. You're still innocent until proven guilty, and you can have dozens of accusations you can indict. I remember an old Democrat buddy of mine who was a very prominent lawyer in Nashville and was a state senator as well. He used to tell me, he said, Tim, you can indict a cheese sandwich, a ham and cheese sandwich. And I never really thought anything of it, but I did, an indictment is just an accusation. Until he goes to court and is found guilty, that's another issue. But indictment is just
These are some pretty wild accusations, though. For you, is it a process issue? Would you feel the same way if you had a wider majority?
No, it wouldn't change it one bit. And I'll be honest with you, George is my buddy. George is a friend of mine. I worry about folks. I've lost friends to suicide and other things, and I don't.
Is that a worry for George Santos?
No, but I don't. You never know. You never know. And that's what I always tell him. I say, George, or I tell other guys. I've told other members of Congress that both parties that have been going through indictments or troubles at home or things. I say, I'm a Christian. I'm not a very good one, but I worry about people. I worry about their souls.
Well, Congressman Tim Burchett, I appreciate the time, sir. I wish we had more of it. This is Bloomberg.
Profits. Headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. S&P 500 index trading lower, down for a second week. The S&P 500 is extending its drop from its July peak to 10%, threshold of a so-called correction. S&P right now down 25, a drop of 0.6%. Dow Industrials down 356 points, down 1%. NASDAQ Composite Index holding on to a 16-point gain, up by about 0.1%. 10-year yield 4.84%, with a 2-year that's yielding 5.01%. Spot gold now up $21 the ounce, back above 2006 right now on the precious metal, up by 1.1%. And West Texas Intermediate crude also advancing up by 3% right now, 85.64 for a barrel of WTI. JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon plans to sell shares currently worth about $141 million. It is the first transaction since he took the helm at the Wall Street giant almost 18 years ago. According to a regulatory filing, beginning next year, Dimon and his family will dispose of 1 million of the lender's shares for financial diversification and tax planning purposes. JP Morgan Chase shares, they are down now by 3.5%. Again, recapping a mixed market. S&P lower by 26 now, down 0.6%. The Dow down 1.1%. NASDAQ up 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
The conversations we have here on the fastest show in politics. I have Kaylee Lines at my side. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, coming off our conversation with the gentleman from Tennessee, Tim Burchett. That was a winding conversation.
Covered a lot of ground. Jinx.
Well, we did. With this new interview with Mike Johnson, our roadmap for some of it at least, you zeroed in for a moment on any potential action that might come from this mass shooting in Maine.
Yeah.
His response sounded a lot like the speaker last evening on Fox.
It did. That this is a mental health problem, knowing that the suspect in this shooting, who I believe still has not been apprehended, right, Joe? This is still a live situation up north, but spent some time in a mental health facility earlier this summer, and that is where a lot of the talking points have gravitated towards.
As they tend to. Here's Mike Johnson, the speaker, last evening on Fox.
At the end of the day, the problem is the human heart. It's not guns, it's not the weapons. At the end of the day, we have to protect the right of the citizens to protect themselves, and that's the Second Amendment. And that's why our party stands so strongly for that. I agree with the comments of your guests there. This is not the time to be talking about legislation. We're in the middle of that crisis right now. But I just want you to know, and I want the American people to know, that all the members of the House here are deeply concerned about the families involved and everyone. And we pray for the law enforcement officers that are doing that hard job tonight that most people do not have the bravery to do.
It does not sound like, and I don't know why we would expect anything to actually happen or come from this. We can hardly fund the government, which we're going to talk to Gregory Corey about in a moment. But how about Jared Golden, the Democrat from Maine, coming out yesterday on this issue and made some news as he kind of changed his position on this altogether. Let's listen.
I have opposed efforts to ban deadly weapons of war like the assault rifle used to carry out this crime. The time has now come for me to take responsibility for this failure, which is why I now call on the United States Congress to ban assault rifles like the one used by the sick perpetrator of this mass killing in my hometown of Lewiston, Maine.
Senator Susan Collins from Maine was criticized heavily for not saying the same thing. But I wonder, Gregory Cordy with us here in studio, Bloomberg Politics reporter, if this moves the needle or if in a week no one's talking about this, assuming this guy is apprehended and, we have a way of moving on.
I can't predict the future, but if the past is any guide, that's exactly what's going to happen. We've seen how many of these events over the past decade or so, mass shootings, and you could write the script, not to be flippant about it. Given,
no, but we can be real.
But yeah, to be real about it, you can write the script from the Democratic side and the Republican side before these events even happen. They stick to the script, and what you heard from the speaker last night was, now is not the time to be talking about this. And of course, that's the frustration from the other side. It's like, if not now, when? Right. President Obama, President Biden have tried to use these incidents to galvanize support around some kind of solution on gun control. And what's interesting about the assault rifle ban is that not that long ago, in the 90s, that was part of the crime bill that received bipartisan support, in part because police are afraid of these weapons, right? And you could get a sort of a centrist moderate coalition to support an assault rifle ban. That expired, and it's been off the table effectively ever since.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, to your point, Gregory, that there is such a consistent pattern here, because we have seen this play out so many times, because this is an unfortunate frequent reality in the United States of America. And yet we know that, especially given the control of the House and the messaging we have heard from Republican members around this, it's unlikely that this time will be any different, essentially. But they do have control of the House, as I said, but it barely, very slim margin, which brings me to another issue that we discussed with Congressman Tim Burchett, and that is the fate of one George Santos, the member from New York. Of course, yesterday we saw an expulsion resolution introduced by members of the delegation from his own state. Tim Burchett said you got to let the legal system play out, but we're going to see a floor vote on this, right? Next week. It's privileged. Are Republicans any more likely to oust one of their own when it will reduce their majority than they are to, say, pass gun control legislation?
That's absolutely the question. There was a previous expulsion resolution over the summer, in May actually, that party line vote got referred to the committee. Kevin McCarthy, then the speaker, dealt with it, moved it on. And now what's different is that, one, Santos has been indicted on more charges, and the New York Republican delegation has now turned on this. We know that margin in the House is so small that it just takes 5 members from that New York delegation to say, we now support expelling him. That's enough to at least survive that motion to table, to move it to committee, and that will require everyone in the House to take an up or down vote whether they agree that George Santos has the moral character to be a member of the House of Representatives. That's going to be a tough vote, but it appears from the Speaker's comments last night that he will be whipping against expulsion, saying he deserves a chance, let the criminal process play it out, and his calculus is a very political one. It's the math. He can't afford to lose many more votes because he just barely won as Speaker with the votes that he has.
He was pretty open about that in the interview last evening. I mean, he actually referred to the margin and then pointed to due process. I guess it's something maybe both Tim Burchett seemed to say it was due, but then he also told us they were friends, so I don't know what to make of that exactly.
Yes.
But here's what the Speaker said on Fox.
Here's the reality, Sean. We have a 4-seat majority in the House. It is possible that that number may be reduced even more in the coming weeks and months, and so we'll have what may be the most razor-thin majority in the history of the Congress. We have no margin for error, and so George Santos is due process, right? He is. My understanding is I think he's appearing in a federal court tomorrow. And we have to allow due process to play itself out. That's what our system of justice is for.
He's not convicted. And he did appear in court today, right? He pleaded not guilty.
Not guilty.
So that's already happened.
Yeah.
Kind of a moment, though, to your point, the New York delegation gathers on the floor to get this done. This is Anthony D'Esposito.
Pursuant to Clause 2A1 of Rule 9, I rise to give notice of my intent to raise a question of the privileges of the House. The form of the resolution is as follows. House Resolution 773. Providing for the expulsion of Representative George Santos from the House of Representatives.
It took him almost 10 minutes to read the whole thing. There's a lot of whereas in this. What kind of a result could we be looking at? You're going to be called publicly, to your point, to take a stand on a very well-known case.
Yeah, and so we've established the math probably gets us to the floor with an up or down vote, and then it takes under the Constitution a 2/3 vote to expel him. We assume every Democrat, as they have done in the past, will vote to expel him, but that still means that we need a significant number of Republicans. We know we can get them out of the New York delegation, and I gotta think there's enough of Republicans who are in districts that Biden won, competitive districts. They don't want to see the attack ad on this, who would also go along. I think, even if you talk to George Santos himself, he doesn't know that he has the math to survive. He's hanging on by his fingernails. But he's also indicated he's going to fight it every step of the way.
Yeah, well, and it's worth noting some of those very New Yorkers that introduced this are also overlapped with those vulnerable individuals who represent districts Biden won in 2020. So say that Santos actually does survive this, which is a very real possibility, then it just continues with the ethics committee, right? What is the possible outcome of that investigation? Could we still see him ultimately expelled from the House anyway, depending on what they find? How does this work?
The timeline that the ethics committee works on, it would be more likely that he would be voted out of office than we would get an investigation back from the ethics committee. Now, when former Speaker Kevin McCarthy first referred this to the ethics committee, he said, "Oh no, we're gonna make this. We're gonna put a rush job on this, and we're gonna get an answer back quickly." History shows the ethics committee does not work quickly. It usually takes longer than the term of a congressman for the ethics committee to investigate these things. And so if that's the route, it could take a while. Meanwhile, Santos faces a lot of competition, both from Republicans and Democrats in his district. It's going to be a hardly fought seat next year, and possibly even earlier than that. If he is expelled, there will have to be a special election in that district.
Boy, this is going to be
a district, I should mention, that Biden won. So that adds to the math that the speaker is talking about when he's worried about that razor-thin margin.
Yeah, he's one of the 18 vulnerable Republicans, but of course I would maybe characterize him as extra vulnerable.
Extra vulnerable.
I
think that's
I would argue he's the most vulnerable congressman in the history of Congress at this point.
That's saying something, I'll tell you. But remarkable stuff, as we were saying. You may have gotten the gavel, but the hard part actually starts now.
Yeah.
Gregory Cordy, great reporting and great conversations this week. Thanks for being with us, as always, Bloomberg politics reporter. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we catch up with Nancy Lyons now for World and National News in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Joe. The manhunt continues for Robert Card, the 40-year-old suspect in that mass shooting in Lewiston, Maine. Mike Sawchuk is Commissioner of Maine Public Safety. He says authorities have received tips that they've been sorting through.
Our officers, our investigators, and that's investigating. I say our, I'm talking about local, county, state, federal, all of our partners, been continuing to work 530 plus tips and leads that have come in from the general public. From a number of communities, a number of different relationships.
Mike Sawchuk says divers will be searching the water near a boat launch where the suspect's car was found. The House and Senate have grand plans next week to tackle government funding, but they may face some logistical challenges.
Lawmakers have until November 17th to pass government funding legislation to avoid a shutdown, but some members are already talking about another stopgap measure. House Speaker Mike Johnson pitched an appropriations plan that included passage of energy and water spending this week and 3 more bills next week. But House members don't return to Washington until Wednesday. Senators, meanwhile, aim to pass their 3-bill appropriations minibus next week and will hold a hearing on a planned national security supplemental spending bill. In Washington, I'm Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
President Biden may be touting his economic agenda, but a Bloomberg Morning Consult poll finds swing state voters believe the economy is heading in the wrong direction. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
Profits. Headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. War fears are driving gold and oil higher. Gold rose to $2,000 an ounce for the first time since May, as concerns over conflict in the Middle East outweigh the impact of high bond yields. Right now, we have got gold trading at $2,004, up today by 1%. Crude is also advancing. West Texas Intermediate crude now with an 85 handle, 85.02, up today by 2.2%. We'll have more on the markets and the Middle East coming up in just a moment with David Weston of Wall Street Week. Stocks are trading mixed. S&P 500 extending a slide from its July peak to 10%. The threshold of a correction right now, the S&P is down 17 at 4120, a drop right now of 0.4%. Dow Industrials down 331 points, lower by 1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index is up 51. That is a gain of 0.4%. 10-year yield 4.85% with a 2-year 5.01%. Gold, as we mentioned, 2003, up now by about 0.9%. Wall Street is looking ahead to next week's Fed meeting, but Tony Rodriguez, head of fixed income strategy at Nuveen Asset Management, sees it as a non-event.
Certainly for next week, I don't think the Fed is all that important. We know that they're not going to hike rates. I think it's pretty much consensus that they're going to have what you would call a hawkish hold. Right now, there's really no incentive for them to do anything but that.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. After earnings, Amazon up 7.1%. After earnings, Intel up by 9.6%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
We've been watching breaking headlines on the terminal coming from Israel for the better part of 2 hours now. And the latest in our Israel latest column, Israel forces expanding ground activity in Gaza. Kaylee, we're hearing from Israeli Defense Forces spokesman Daniel Hagari. And this is following another overnight raid, which they referred to as a limited raid. Ambassador James Jeffrey earlier in the program called it a tank raid, basically used to tenderize an area before you go in with a larger scale invasion. So there are a lot of questions today about whether we're actually on the precipice of something here.
Yeah, what we heard from the IDF today was essentially they're stepping up their aerial attacks on those underground targets and that they are expanding ground activity this evening. What exactly that expansion looks like before potentially a bigger expansion, I guess we'll all have to wait and see. But the continued concern here, Joe, is that this expands far beyond the conflict that is currently being engaged between Israel and Hamas, and that this becomes a wider problem in the Middle East.
Well, that's true. We woke up to headlines today about American fighter jets striking
in Syria,
targets in eastern Syria, which really kind of raises the temperature here. This is not a proxy war when it's actual F-16s with American flags on them doing this. Those were believed to be installations used by Iran's Revolutionary Guard. So the temperature is rising today. And we want to start our weekly conversation with David Weston right there. Of course, the host of Bloomberg's Wall Street Week. David has spent a lot of time in geopolitics, and we're curious, David, great to see you, your thoughts on this, and to what extent we should be careful or to what extent we should be reading into these headlines.
Well, thanks. It's great to be with you, Joe, even during such a difficult time. The first thing I learned the hard way in covering wars is you always got to be careful because you never know what's really going on. The first 1, 2, and 3 reports I've ever gotten have always been wrong, so you just don't know where it is. This could be the beginning of something really bigger in Gaza or not. And I suspect part of the Israeli strategy here is to keep us all off guard. So particularly the Hamas doesn't know what's going on and how big it's going to be. We talked earlier today with Tom Nides, who has spent his career basically going back and forth between Wall Street on the one hand, a long time at Morgan Stanley, and the State Department on the other. He just got done, ironically, with being the U.S. ambassador to Israel just last month, just shortly before this this war began, and he's certainly focused on exactly what you said, Joe, which is trying not to have this expand beyond. And particularly, he focuses on Hezbollah up in the north with Lebanon, and he said it all comes down to Iran. That's what the United States is doing right now, is trying to bring as much pressure to bear as possible through surrogates like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Egypt on Iran to send a message: just don't get involved, Iran, because if that happens, then we've got a very different story here.
Well, David, on the subject of Saudi Arabia, in an interview with the New York Times this week, Senator Richard Blumenthal, who of course is a member of the Armed Services Committee, said he met with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman last weekend, and the Saudi leadership was warning about a ground invasion, saying that it could be extremely harmful. Basically, that an invasion of Gaza could ultimately be catastrophic. And of course, David, this comes at a time when before the events of October 7th and everything that has followed, we were talking increasingly about potentially normalization in the Saudi Arabia-Israel relationship.
Yeah, exactly, Kelly. And I think, as you know well, I think the reports are the United States as well is warning about what really a full-scale invasion of Gaza would look like. I mean, it is very ugly for everybody involved, not just Hamas, that I think no one has a lot of sympathy for. But one of the things we did talk to Tom about was, what about the longer term? I mean, at some point, we hope sooner rather than later, but at some point this will be over. Has what has happened there really derailed what has happened in terms of negotiating a peace settlement between Saudi Arabia and Israel? And this is what Tom said. He has at least some hope with a lot of trepidation at the same time.
I'm actually quite confident after this is over, and God knows how long it will be, that the Saudis will in fact want to reengage, because quite frankly, they see the same threat that we see and Israel sees, which is the Iranian threat. They've seen part of it through the Houthis and Yemen. So my view of this is that with the work of MBS, with the work of the White House and the Israelis, my hope is, and I think strongly believe, that this chance of a Saudi normalization is certainly not dead. It is delayed, yes, but certainly not dead.
That's Tom being hopeful that at some point we'll get it back on track, because there are such powerful incentives, as you know very well, Joe and Kayleigh, particularly economic incentives for Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince and for Israel, if they can somehow get back to the table. But we have to get past an awful lot before that happens.
At what point, we've been watching oil prices as kind of a metric here for market sentiment, David. At what point does this become market negative for stocks?
Well, I think it is a question of expansion. Everyone that I've talked to, not just Tom, but everybody else has said it's really a question of how far does it go beyond that. I mean, there can be fluctuations from day to day, for example, in the price of oil. And of course, this is a very different situation from what we had in the 70s, because the United States is a net exporter now. And by the way, the overall economy is not as dependent on oil. So I'm not sure that we're talking about something like the oil embargo of the 1970s. It really almost crippled the U.S. economy. At the same time, if you have a real expansion of the conflict, it goes well beyond oil. I mean, because it raises an awful lot of uncertainties on a lot of fronts. And of course, China is just on the periphery. Russia's just on the periphery. It gets very complicated very fast.
And we know that markets do not like uncertainty, and geopolitical uncertainty is no exception, David. But of course, the reason we so key in on energy prices is because we're still fighting a fight here against inflation. And that's just underscored by the data we got, the Fed's preferred inflation gauge, core PCE, earlier today. I would imagine you're going to be breaking that down on Wall Street Week this evening as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to spend some time, particularly with Roger Altman, who founded Evercore, about what's going on, certainly with inflation, where we are with that, where the economy is, but also this economy that I keep saying I just don't believe how strong it is after we've had 500 basis points worth of rate increases over a record short period of time. You would think that we'd be slowing down here at some point, and yet you saw the GDP numbers come in, you see the PCE numbers, and it's going to make it hard for the Fed to back off. I'm not sure they're going to cut rates. I think everybody's over-anticipating that personally, from what I've heard, but I'm not sure that they're going to be hesitant to keep them up high for a while.
Well, we look forward to hearing all about it on Bloomberg's Wall Street Week, which is David's great franchise that follows Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Bloomberg Business Week here on Bloomberg Radio. It's something that you don't want to miss with David Weston, and it's great to see you, David, as always. Thanks for your insights on a range of topics. I feel like we can talk about anything with David Weston and learn something.
He knows it all.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we do this every week.
That's right.
Kayleigh does too. She knows.
I also like talking to David because I know it means it's Friday.
There's something to that, right? I mean, is that a great association? I think that's cool. Final thoughts straight ahead. I'm Joe Matthew with Kaylee Lines in Washington. What a week we have had. We're going to have a little Schoolhouse Rock coming up. Actually, an update to Schoolhouse Rock.
Oh,
you didn't even see this coming. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. ExxonMobil down 2% after earnings. Exxon sees tight global oil supplies putting upward pressure on energy prices for at least the next few years as the world continues to suffer from a lack of investment in fossil fuels. ExxonMobil CEO Darren Woods was interviewed on Bloomberg Radio this morning, and in a wide-ranging conversation, he talked about a number of topics, including Exxon's refinery business.
So if you look at what we've been doing in refinery, we've been concentrating our refinery footprint and focusing on the strategic refineries that are producing high-value products in the lubricant space, the chemical space, the fuel space, the traditional fuel space, but also the opportunity to use our technology to then bring in biofuels and biofeeds to make lower emissions fuels.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Talks podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Chevron fell short of analysts' expectations amid weak returns from its overseas refineries as the oil giant moves closer to the $53 billion purchase of rival S-Corp. Today, we're looking at shares of both companies. Laura, right now we do have shares of Chevron. They are down by 6.4%. Again, ExxonMobil trading lower now by by just about 2.1%. GM's driverless taxi unit Cruise has grounded its entire fleet only days after its license was suspended by the state of California. And those are some of our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
As we update world and national news now, and one of the big stories coming up, I just have to warn you, they're remaking Schoolhouse Rock. That's next after Nancy Lyons talks to us from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. A shelter-in-place order remains in effect around Lewiston, Maine, as authorities continue to search for the suspect in that mass shooting Wednesday night that killed 18 people and injured 13 others. Mike Sawchuk leads the Maine Department of Public Safety. He says they'll be searching a river near where the suspect's car was found.
You're going to see some air resources that will fly over this particular area, and they're looking to see what can we clear from the air. Do I have to put divers in that particular area, or can I tell from the top, based on the current and how muddy the water is and all those other things, can I see to the very bottom here?
Sawchuk says they're also doing ground searches and checking up on more than 500 tips. Sam Bankman-Fried, who founded cryptocurrency exchange FTX, has been testifying today in his fraud trial. Bloomberg legal reporter Tony Ahrens is following those proceedings.
He was being contrite. He said he'd made mistakes, big and small. The biggest was not having a chief risk officer, which he admitted came back to haunt them all. But after that, he really talked about what he didn't do more than what he did do. He was painting himself as kind of an out-of-touch CEO.
Bloomberg's Tony Ahrens says Bankman-Fried testified he was concerning himself mostly with FTX and not with what else was happening. His cross-examination is expected to spill into next week. In Donald Trump's civil fraud trial, the judge today ordered Trump's daughter, Ivanka, to testify. Her father is accused of inflating his assets by billions in financial documents provided to banks and insurers. Prosecutors want to ask Ivanka Trump about financial transactions that were carried out by the Trump Organization. She is no longer a defendant in the case, but the state says she has personal knowledge of facts relevant to the claims against the remaining defendants, including her father and brothers, Don Jr. and Eric Trump. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Joe and Kaylee.
Right, Nancy, thanks. You know, we all grew up with Schoolhouse Rock. I've played it many times here on Sound On because sometimes I feel like lawmakers could use a refresher.
Right.
Especially when this whole regular order thing goes out the window. I mean, it actually doesn't apply at all. If you listen to the old one, well, we don't do it that way anymore. So they're making a new one. Not that it's about, you know, chaos in the House, but it's about appealing to kids. And the First Lady, Jill Biden, announcing this thing today with Nickelodeon called Well Versed. Variety's even writing it up. It's a new series that will update the themes of Schoolhouse Rock. Are you ready? This is like the up-to-date.
Okay.
This is you're
Modern
gonna start
era.
moving as soon as you hear this.
Civics
Well-versed.
education.
The three branches of government are called legislative, executive, and the judicial.
Okay.
Is this like K-pop?
Well, it's pop. Here's a different one.
We're a constitutional democracy. Oh, yeah.
What do we think of this?
I know people on YouTube can no longer see this, but my jaw is on the floor.
Yeah, this is, look, I mean, we've come a long way from the old one, and every Saturday morning I used to roll with, I'm just a bill.
Yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well,
you can't beat it, right?
A long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee.
In committee. I'm not sure which one will appeal to the youngsters, but Nickelodeon, are you up on this or not? I can't tell.
Government are called legislative, executive, and the judicial.
Wait, and they say constitutional democracy really, really fast?
Come on. This is for the kiddos here. Here we go. Constitution.
I don't think
All
you
right.
can make this catchy. I don't know.
Carol Masser is not a fan of this one. Carol likes the old one, and I think we're with you, Carol. I see you in the chat there. Brendan is just having too much
Yes,
fun.
I'm only a bill.
So we should really send things back to New York.
Well,
This is too fun,
Kaylee. Long, long journey to the capital.
I'll meet you
city.
on Capitol
It's a
Hill
long,
a
long
little later
way
on today.
while I'm sitting
I'm Joe
and
Matthew with
committed,
Kaylee Lyons.
but I
Bloomberg
know
Business
I'll be
Week
all
starts right now.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
Very good afternoon, everyone. Live from our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio, streaming on YouTube and, of course, on Bloomberg Originals. It is TGIF, Friday, October 27th. Yeah, that is. Whoa. And listen, I'm going to put in my vote. Stick with the old schoolhouse rock.
The new one's great.
No.
Yeah, come on.
Unless you're doing Taylor's version, stick with the oldies.
All right, Taylor's version. That's a deep tease. I like it, Carol. Hey,
what?
Taylor's version of the S&P 500. Not doing so well today. Maybe it needs a little Taylor Swift magic.
Is she not a billionaire anymore now?
She's probably still a billionaire thanks
right.
to ticket sales and value of her music. But the S&P 500 has dropped 10% from its July peak. That's the threshold, Carol, of a so-called correction. Kind of doesn't necessarily mesh with the upbeat economic data we got this week.
Consumers are spending, inflation coming in hot, or I guess up the most in the past 4 months. So it's not easy making a call in this market environment. Having said that, it also gets complicated by what's going on in the Middle East. We've got a great voice on that. A former Israeli consul general in New York, former chief of staff and foreign policy advisor to 2 Israeli foreign ministers, was an advisor to former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Ambassador Alon Pincus will be with us to kind of assess the situation, where we go from here, the impending ground invasion, and maybe what happens after.
Looking forward to that interview with him a little bit later in the program. Also, if you've been following us this week, you know it's been a tale of 2 big tech companies flying high, at least in today's trade. We're talking about those 2 companies that reported after the bell yesterday, Amazon and Intel. We're going to dive into their reports
They're
in a
like,
few
what
minutes.
sell-off? We're doing just okay.
Yeah, they're okay.
They're okay. We're also going to get, as we said, a tale of 2 billionaires. We're going to talk about Taylor Swift because, folks, she is apparently a newly minted billionaire. We did some number crunching here at Bloomberg News. And then there's kind of an older billionaire. I didn't know he was worth as much as he is, but he's doing some selling. I feel like he's the ultimate insider. Jamie Dimon selling 1 million shares of stock, or planning to. He did an SEC filing, so we're going to get into that.
And then, as you mentioned, on the Israeli-Hamas conflict, we've got a great voice coming up. And can you believe, Carol, it's been a year since Elon Musk bought Twitter?
No.
Feels like 5 years.
Elon, if you're listening to me, first of all, come on and join us. Tim and I would love to have you. And secondly, please bring back TweetDeck and the old Twitter.
Can we call it Twitter, please?
I am. Also, the Business Week show, a new episode dropping, and it has the founder of Lululemon who said something to the SEC and then backtracked. So we're going to get into that. But right now, it's all about the markets. Over to our TV colleagues, folks. We've got Countdown to the Close starting right now.
Countdown to the close. Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage ahead of the U.S. market close starts right now.
This is the Countdown to the Close. Romaine Bostic alongside Scarlett Fu. We're joined right now by our colleagues Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec, fresh off their 2-day vacation. Welcome to our audiences across all of our Bloomberg platforms, television, radio. I can't hear you, Carol. I'm still doing the intro here. And, of course, Bloomberg Originals and our partnership with YouTube. Carol Masser, you missed a lot the last 2 days while you guys were on vacation here. But we talk about a market that really has had trouble finding any sort of direction.
Actually, we were in the perfect place to talk about this market that's having a tough time finding direction. We were at Schwab Impact 2023. It was all investment advisors, registered investment advisors, the top voices from Schwab, trying to assess where we go from here. Some interesting conversations, including maybe it's time to look overseas rather than the U.S. markets. Having said that, we want to focus on the U.S. market because we've got 2 billionaires to talk about. I saw you guys talking a little bit about one of them earlier, but Jamie Dimon moving shares of JP Morgan. They are down, really underperforming in today's session. They're down about 3.8%. On news that he plans to sell and did an SEC filing on selling 1 million shares of JP Morgan. We're talking about $141 million. It's his first stock sale during his tenure, almost nearly 18 years at the helm of JP Morgan. Kind of interesting, said to be financial diversification, tax planning purposes. First thing that popped into my head, and apparently Mike Mayo thinking the same thing, it's a reminder that, he is getting close to retirement.
Yeah, I think that was the first thing that popped in. Everyone said, is this now the exit
Are you
plan?
saying I'm a commoner and thinking?
No, I'm not.
Felt
I'm not
that
saying
way.
you're a commoner here. But I was also fascinated by the idea that he had never had a share sale
Me
during his
too.
tenure. But I guess, when you think about the value of compounding, you think about the share performance that this company has had over the last, 15 years.
Did you see what he's worth? $2 billion.
Yes, I saw what it's worth.
Well, look at the return of JP Morgan shares
Did I?
over his tenure at the helm. Okay, it's an increase of almost 250%, more than 10 times the gain of the S&P 500. Then you have to go back to 2009 in the wake of the financial crisis, Romaine. He bought 500,000 shares. This was a sign of confidence. He did the same thing back in 2016. He spent about $38 million doing that. Now he's selling some stock.
But it's a reminder of how leveraged he was to JP Morgan. He was long to JP Morgan in every way, right? Through his salary, through his job, and of course through all this exposure through equity.
Don't you really, you think about he's the lone CEO standing from the financial crisis. So during that time going through the crisis, coming out of it, he probably had to be very sensitive to show any signs of kind of bailing on the company. I mean, it really was a sign of endorsement, a big sign of endorsement.
There was never a good time, right?
No,
well,
but especially
remember that it was like, I don't know, I can't remember what quarter it was, but I remember a few years ago when the share price had sort of taken a hit, and he was asked on a conference call here whether he was still buying shares, and he was like, all day, every day. And, but I mean, he has always been a big champion of the company, obviously, as you would want to be as a CEO, but really, anytime there were those criticisms, this idea here that maybe, the stock wasn't worth what it was, he always made a show of making sure that the public understood that he thought it was still a buy.
The ultimate insider, right, guys?
Yeah.
Jamie Dimon, billionaire. Taylor Swift, billionaire. For everyone else, and let's talk about baby boomers versus millennials.
I mean, Jamie Dimon versus Taylor Swift, right?
Yeah,
kind of makes sense.
I want to put them together to talk money. I just would love to do that.
That's a great way of framing this, Tim, because there's a great call from Bank of America that says if you're going to look at demographics and consumer spending patterns, you want to go long what baby boomers buy, and you want to short what millennials are buying, because millennials have less disposable income at their reach, especially with the resumption of student loan payments and just the pressure. A lot of them don't own homes, and if they do want to, they're paying exorbitant fees and mortgage rates for it.
So if you're thinking, Romaine, buy healthcare and entertainment. If you're thinking, Tim, maybe you do some different things. You sell clothing retailers?
Yeah, that's what Bank of America is saying. I will say you have to exclude Taylor Swift from this conversation because she owns a lot of real estate. Bloomberg puts that value at $110 million.
I'm confused. Did Carol just insult me? It went over my head.
Did she think you were a boomer?
I mean, I know. I mean, I'm so much younger than her, so I can't, sometimes.
Actually, I think we're all Gen X, in which case no one pays attention to us.
I say nothing. I'm going to say I've seen the real estate, the Rhode Island real estate that Taylor Swift has. It is gorgeous.
Oh, okay.
Really
You've
beautiful.
been there? You got invited?
I've taken pictures. I've done a little selfie with my daughter.
You're a Swiftie.
Did you get arrested?
Security escorted her
totally
away,
a Swiftie.
but
Carol.
she still got the picture.
All right, guys, we're going to be back. We're going to wrap up this day of trading and, of course, the week of trading. We're going to be back in less than an hour's time. Our cross-platform radio, TV, YouTube, and, of course, Bloomberg Originals. Join us for Beyond the Bell at 4 p.m. Wall Street time.
Just move on up.
All right, folks, we're staying with the markets, and actually really two particular names, because as we just talked about, we've got stocks near their lows, some nervousness. The S&P 10% down from its peak in July. But if you look at something like an Amazon, which makes up about 5.5% of the NASDAQ 100, nearly 3.4% of the S&P 500, earlier helping send stocks higher in the session, you've got Amazon really rallying in a big way and holding on to, Tim, most of its gains today.
Yeah, up 7% as we speak. Help sending stocks overall higher, at least earlier in the session, Carol, although the broader market has slipped since then. Intel is also higher on the day today. The company in the midst of an attempted turnaround in which the CEO, Pat Gelsinger, commented on, saying the chipmaker is, quote, clearly coming back. We're going to spend this time right now taking a look at both of these two very closely watched companies in the tech world. Let's start with Amazon.
Let's do that. And with us right now is Poonam Goyal. She is Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Analyst for E-commerce, Athleisure, Off-Price Retail on Zoom from New Jersey. Poonam, I'm so glad we have you here, as we always do when we want to talk Amazon. You focus on the retail side of this company, but to be fair, you look at it holistically. What was the impressive, or what impressed you about the earnings and the color on the business when it comes to Amazon?
Yes, thanks, Carol. So there were really two things. You know, Amazon has two really big businesses. One is the cloud business and one is the retail business. And let's start with the retail business. I think the retail business did particularly well, both on the 1P and 3P side. Sales are much stronger than expected. And that's a really good sign going into holidays because we know that the consumers are clearly stretched for their dollars, but they're finding value in Amazon. Amazon's able to push this value again to them through Prime Days and deal days that they'll have, I think, throughout the Christmas season with Black Friday, Cyber Monday, etc. So we think that's good going into holiday. And then on the AWS side, the fact that they were more optimistic than their peers on the cloud business, seeing strength with stabilization, was really encouraging to hear on the call. And we are very positive on the cloud business longer term. The margins there, 30% plus, were obviously nice to see too. And we do think that cloud business in the longer term with scale will be over 40%.
So, Poonam, why did sales for AWS just miss expectations? And I was a little confused by this move yesterday. I said it on air. I thought AWS was kind of everything, and that's, whether it beat or missed was what moved the company's stock. Why are you optimistic, and why are investors still pushing shares higher, even if there was that miss on AWS?
I mean, I guess it depends on how you look at this, right? So 12% versus the 12.4% estimate in my eyes isn't really a big miss. It was in line with what they did last quarter, meaning the second quarter. So the 12% gains relative to what we heard at both Google and Microsoft wasn't that bad. And I think really the icing on the cake here is on the call when Andy Jassy came on and he spoke about how that they're seeing stabilization from those trends even into the fourth quarter. I think that was just really encouraging. We all know that cloud spending will pick up in a matter of time. Businesses have to move towards integrating more cloud into their network, as well as they need to spend more on AI. So Amazon is very well positioned for AWS growth in the longer term. And the fact that things are stabilizing was good news to us. And I think that's how the market perceived it too.
Can you make the Amazon AI connection here? I think a lot of people might not be familiar with why, a boost in AI will help AWS.
Yeah, so a boost in AI helps not only AWS, but it also helps the retail side of the business. So when you think about what AI does, it basically helps build models and interpret data and models for businesses. So the fact that AWI can lean on newer AI technologies and embed that into its infrastructure, it's going to help companies use that and leverage that in their own businesses.
Wait.
On the retail side.
Oh, keep going. No. Keep going.
On the retail side, AI has been doing phenomenal things, especially generative AI, where it's helping you predict demand, it's helping you streamline inventory, and it's helping you personalize, which is just driving conversion higher in an industry that typically, especially online, has very low conversion rates.
So, and does it make sense that I always think about, when we first learned about AWS and they started breaking it out, right? Because of all the streaming that was going on, and you're like, I don't really care who supplies the content. We're just making sure we have the pipe to get it to you, basically, right? And that's what AWS was just so involved in the early days. Is that kind of akin to with AI that people are going to need the infrastructure, the backbone, and are they going to be involved in that part?
So it's software, right? So
Yeah.
AI is basically, it's software that's powered through AWS and that they're integrating and embedding into the cloud platform. So as businesses need to become more agile and move on to the cloud, AI can only be done on the cloud. So you need that support, and for businesses that don't have it, which many don't, they will need to either tap into Amazon's AWS or Google or Microsoft, one of them. But keep in mind, Amazon is the largest cloud provider of the three.
All right, good stuff, as always. So appreciate it. Have a great weekend. Poonam Goyal, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Analyst for e-commerce, athleisure, and off-price retail on Zoom from New Jersey. So from Amazon to Intel we go, Tim. Intel right now up 9.4%.
Yeah, it surged at one point the most in 3 years. This after predicting a return to sales growth in the fourth quarter. With the Intel story, we head on over to San Francisco, where we find on Zoom Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Semiconductor Analyst Kunjan Sabani. Kunjan, good to have you with us. Your biggest takeaway from Intel earnings?
Yeah, a couple of good things came out, both for the near term and the long term. Near term, the PC seems to be recovering faster and better than most people expected. And the company reaffirmed its 270 million unit PC shipment target, which means, again, a growth quarter coming into 4Q. So that was pretty good. That's what drove most of the beat, both in 3Q and 4Q outlook. And a couple of good signs in terms of long term. They signed another 2 Intel 18A foundry customers and signed 2 packaging customers. And there was a lot more discussion about how they're working with more packaging customers that they're planning to sign.
Hey, do you agree with CEO Pat Gelsinger, who was on air at Bloomberg earlier today? If you missed it, you can check it out on the Bloomberg and at Bloomberg.com. But he said chip makers clearly coming back from the numbers. Kunjan, do you agree that that's the case for Intel, or TBD?
Yeah. Well, to some extent, yes. So you have to sort of peel the onion. Look, if the PC market is coming back, which is their biggest revenue segment, and they have the largest share in there, definitely it helps them come back, right? Sort of. But more than that, I think what is implying to sort of this promise of turnaround, which involves gaining manufacturing lead, 5 nodes in 4 years, and also gaining product lead. So they have been, for the past year or so, they have been, hitting on each of the milestones. So from that, I agree that it is coming back. There is still some work to be done.
So what's the highest margin business for this company? What's the growth business for Intel going forward, or has to be for them going forward?
Well, like most chip companies, it has to be AI, right? That's what will drive the fastest growth. In terms of margin, at this point, look, they supply their main business is server CPU across the data center. So AI is a very small portion right now, but they have a lot of volume when it comes to general purpose compute, your server, storage servers, networking servers, etc., which don't deliver the highest ASP and margins. But as sort of the AI CPUs start, and the Gaudi, which is their AI accelerator product, start becoming a higher portion, that's where most of the incremental margin and incremental growth will be coming from there.
Kunjan, take us into
and of course,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Of course, the next thing, which is, again, the jury is still out, is this AI PC.
Yeah.
And as you heard announcements from a couple of companies trying to go in, because that looks like a sort of a growth catalyst for this slow-moving PC market. So if, they are able to keep the large share of that AI PC or get more share, that should be another sort of growth catalyst for them.
We have about 30 seconds left, but I want you to take us inside the head of a CTO or somebody in a position of decision maker who's choosing between buying a product from Intel or NVIDIA. What's going to determine who they buy that from?
Well, right now, they're selling 2 complete different products. NVIDIA is mostly GPU.
On the AI side, though.
Well, even on the AI side, you need both a GPU and a server CPU, right? So right now, the decision in terms of GPU is there's only NVIDIA. There's not much to debate. On the server side, typically customers think between, do I buy an Intel CPU or an AMD CPU?
Okay.
All right.
Very helpful.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Hey, listen, so appreciate it. Have a great weekend. Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Semiconductor Analyst Kunjan Sobhani joining us on Zoom in San Francisco. Headline Crossing, Story Crossing by Thomas Buckley. Disney once again overhauling its movie release calendar, delaying 3 films that had previously been scheduled for next year and removing another from the lineup altogether. And we do have shares of Disney a little bit lower in today's session.
Snow White, one of those.
Yeah.
It's moving to 2025. This is Bloomberg.
news, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg, and we are trading at just about the lows of the day. 39 minutes to go ahead of the closing bell. We've got the Dow, the S&P, they're both lower. NASDAQ and the NASDAQ 100 index both advancing, helped by Amazon and Intel. Apple, by the way, reports next week. We've got Amazon up now by 7%. Intel shares after earnings advancing by 9%. But again, lows of the day right now on the S&P 500 index, down 27 points. That is a drop right now of about 0.7%. So the S&P is extending a slide from its July peak now to 10%. That is the threshold of a correction. Oil has topped $85 a barrel. Gold hit $2,000 amid the latest geopolitical developments. 10-year yield 4.83% right now on the 10-year. We have got the 2-year yielding 5.00%. So, given the selling, should investors be buying? Lisa Shallett is Chief Investment Officer for Wealth Management at Morgan Stanley Wealth Management.
Look, we're not interested in getting in here unless you're a trader. What we, tend to point our clients to is being investors, being long-term investors, and our perspective has been that we're going to continue to trade in this bear market range, which is where we've been for 2 years.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance Podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. J.P. Morgan Chase shares down 3.8% right now as CEO Jamie Dimon plans to sell shares currently worth about $141 million. Again, recapping, spot gold 2,007 the ounce, West Texas Intermediate crude 85.06 a barrel. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Massar, Tim Stanovic back at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City, our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio on YouTube, and of course on Bloomberg Originals. Just checking our most read, we are keeping all of the Bloomberg users up to date on the latest when it comes to Israel and Hamas, the conflict there. Israeli forces are expanding their activity in the Gaza Strip. A defense spokesman said as Gaza lost internet and phone service and Israel stepped up airstrikes, Tim, in the area.
Yeah, that spokesperson saying in a press briefing that Israel has stepped up aerial attacks and underground targets and is, quote, expanding ground activity, as you mentioned. Hagari, the spokesperson, is advising people not to pay attention to reports that a hostage deal is near. So that conflicts with earlier reports that they were closer to reaching a ceasefire agreement over hostage release.
There's a lot going on, and it's all really tough and complicated. For the latest on the war, we turn to someone with so much experience in the Israeli government. Ambassador Alon Pincus was Israel's consul general in New York. Before that was chief of staff and foreign policy advisor to 2 Israeli foreign ministers and was an advisor to former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. He's now a writer for the left-leaning Israel newspaper Haaretz, and we are delighted to have him joining us, I believe, from Tel Aviv on this Friday. First of all, Ambassador Pincus, thank you so much for joining us. What can you tell us? First of all, I hope, to be quite honest, your family, friends, that they are doing okay. What can you tell us about the latest on the situation in Israel specifically?
Hi, Carol. Thank you for the well-wishing. Everyone's fine. Yes, indeed, I am in Tel Aviv following 3 sirens in the last several hours. So I am fine. Here's the thing, Carol. The ground operation that everyone's been talking about for the last week at least has, for all intents and purposes, begun. The question now is, or what you and I and everyone else watching and observing this should be looking for, is the scope and the scale and the intensity of this ground operation. It could go in one of several ways. It could be a massive, large-scale ground forces entering the Gaza Strip with the intent of eliminating or obliterating Hamas, and that entails almost inevitably a reoccupation, at least of large portions of the Gaza Strip. A second possibility, which we have started to want to see today, is what is called S&D, search and destroy, a term that, by the way, goes back to the American military in Vietnam in the 60s. That means smaller forces making pinpoint incursions into a given area, searching, destroying Hamas, and then leaving swiftly, meaning no encampment, no setting up headquarters, no immobile targets. The third possibility is that what we've seen until now is just a blip on the radar, and it's going to all go away tomorrow and possibly be renewed in a few days. So what we need to look for is which of these three options is going to materialize.
Ambassador Pincus, help us understand what this looks like on the other side of this conflict, because I have a really hard time understanding how people who live in Gaza right now ever have okay feelings toward Israel, and vice versa.
I totally understand that, and I totally sympathize with their hopelessness and misery. However, Hamas is the organization that is occupying Gaza. Hamas is the organization that is depriving them of dignity, life, and the pursuit of happiness, if you will. Hamas is not just Israel's problem. It's part of a new axis of evil. All that being said and established, I fully understand what they're going through, and my heart goes out to them. Not everyone in Gaza supports Hamas, and not everyone in Gaza condones the barbarity and the savagery of what they committed on October 7th. But even they do not deserve the fate or the havoc that Hamas has brought about on them.
Ambassador Pincus, I think no one would disagree. Terrorists are terrorists, and wherever they are, that is not a good situation. So would you agree that Israel removes Hamas in whatever mode that they ultimately do, and then Israel no longer occupies Gaza or the West Bank, and then moves aggressively fast towards a two-state relationship? Is that the solution that is necessary? Because the way it's been existing certainly has not worked, and you can get a feel that Palestinians want their own place with own representation.
Well, what you just described, Carol, is the only silver lining that exists here, and I'm happy that you mentioned that, because while now 9.5 out of every 10 Israelis would dismiss you and deride you for even coming up with the two-state solution. On the other hand, I think that this October 7th was a point of inflection after which many people on both sides will realize, hopefully, that this can't go on, and this is not sustainable. And even if a two-state solution does not seem feasible, viable, implementable in the short term, and I go back to what President Biden said, this needs to be the vision. Now, but you also, in your question, Carol, you also touched on a practical issue. Okay, let's assume that Hamas is removed and eliminated or incapacitated politically to the point that they cannot or no longer govern the Gaza Strip. Who then controls the Gaza Strip? The Palestinian Authority, which Mr. Netanyahu's government has bent backwards to weaken and encroach on, cannot walk into Gaza on Israeli bayonets. The Americans are not seen, nor are they interested, but they're not seen by the Palestinians as honest brokers. Egypt can. So the question is who?
Well, that's what I think we wanted to get into is who can help broker this in Israel? And let me ask you very bluntly, does Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu he's not the person to do it, and does somebody else? Does he need to be removed? And then who among the allies, whether it's in the Middle East or who of the other partners can make it happen?
Well, you asked two separate questions, one which is domestic political in Israel and one which is regional, who could do this? So let me try and briefly answer both. No, Mr. Netanyahu cannot be trusted to do this. His incompetence in the last few years leading to this, and his incompetence until now in managing this war, makes him the least suitable man amongst 10 million Israelis to manage this war. So I think I've made myself clear here. Removed, well, that's a political issue. He should have resigned, but he didn't. He's not wired that way, but that's okay. He is who he is, and we are where we are. So he is going to manage this war, and let's say, and I now move to the second part of your question, he now moves to eliminate Hamas, which I'm not sure that he's doing, by the way, because there doesn't seem to be a clear, coherent, and attainable political objective here. But let's assume that there is. Who can run this? Well, okay. The only thing that could work in Gaza is to demilitarize it and put it under an international trusteeship. It sounds complicated, I know. It sounds not doable, I know. But then again, everything else was just about bloodshed and carnage. There needs to be, a combination of the Arab and NATO and the Saudis and so on.
Interesting. All right. I so wish Tim and I both wished we had a little bit more time, but I hope we can get you back soon. Although I kind of hope we don't, because I hope that means the conflict is over. But nonetheless, I do hope we can lean on you for your expertise in the future. Ambassador Alon Pincus, Israel's Consul General in New York, many other positions that make him such an informed voice on the situation, Tim.
Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. We've got Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. You've been talking about it. Israeli forces are increasing their activity in the Gaza Strip, bombing targets and expanding ground operations. Israeli defense spokesman Daniel Hagari says they know that Hamas is shielding its fighters by staging them in hospitals.
Hamas uses hospitals as their infrastructures. Hamas has turned hospitals into command and control centers and hideouts for Hamas terrorists and commanders.
Hagari also advised people to disregard reports that a hostage deal is close. Well, the U.S. health system is coping with a shortage of registered nurses, and nowhere more than in hospitals.
The Senate Health Committee held a hearing in New Brunswick, New Jersey, to hear complaints of poor working conditions and overwork from nurses and their local union leader, Debbie White.
The migration out of hospitals, the number one reason, poor staffing. The second is burnout, related to poor staffing. We can't retain nurses in hospitals because of understaffing.
White said several states have passed laws mandating adequate hospital staffing, and both nurses and patients fare better in those states. In Washington, Irv Chapman, Bloomberg Radio.
A suspected mass shooter remains at large. Maine Public Safety Commissioner Mike Sawchuk says they're conducting water searches where the suspect's car was found, and says a shelter-in-place order remains.
We want to make sure that we bring this individual to custody, but we got to do it right. We got to do it the safe way. Don't want to see anybody else get hurt, certainly our people and our community members. So we want to make sure that we do that right. We're not going to be rushed, but we're running right on that level, that we're going to work as hard as we can, as fast as we can, with as many resources as we can.
About 700 square miles are under shelter-in-place orders. Global news, 24 hours a day.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 3:40 on Wall Street, and we begin with a developing story. Google is committing $2 billion in funding to the AI startup Anthropic. That's according to the Wall Street Journal. The Journal says Google invested $500 million up front and agreed to add more over time. We are looking at a down day for the Dow, the S&P. We've got NASDAQ holding on to a gain. NASDAQ 100 index also higher. Let's head right over to the First Word breaking news desk for today's afternoon call. And here he is, Bill Maloney.
And good afternoon, Charlie. Stocks mixed today with a tough day for the Dow. Dow is currently down 445 points. S&Ps are down 23, but NASDAQ is still higher by 10. The U.S. 10-year yield at 4.84%. Gold is up 23. Oil trading in the green, but Bitcoin is down by 1.6%. Among the main 11 S&P sectors, leaders were consumer discretionary and tech. Energy, financials, and healthcare led to the downside. Leaders to the upside in the Dow, Intel and Honeywell, while JP Morgan, Amgen, and Verizon all fell 3%. And led to the downside. After earnings, Intel rose 9.5%, Amazon climbed 6.9%, and Chipotle jumped by 5.7%. Wrapping things up, Jamie Dimon plans to sell $141 million worth of JP Morgan stock. Shares are down 3.7%. Live from the First Word breaking news desk, on Bill Maloney. Charlie.
Okay, we thank you very much, Bill Maloney. Have a great weekend, and to hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg, type SQUA, S-Q-U-A, on your Bloomberg terminal. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no. Who's gonna drive you home? Honey, please, I'll do the driving. Drive on. Excuse me, I want to drive. It's
the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
All right, just about 17 and a half minutes left in today's trading session, getting ready to wrap up the day, the week. It's been a little crazy.
Yeah, what a week. Because at the S&P 500 down almost 3% this week. Same with the NASDAQ composite.
Yeah, that's some selling, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. In a week where we got certainly some strong economic news.
Some earnings that were mixed bag.
Yeah, some earnings that were mixed bag. Hot inflation. Consumers still spending.
Yeah.
Taylor's still a billionaire.
She is. She's going to be fine. I'm not worried about Taylor.
All right, let's see, though, how investors can maybe be kind of fine when it comes to their investments. Let's get to Eric Clark. He's portfolio manager at Rational Dynamic Brands Fund on Zoom in San Diego. By the way, the Rational Dynamic Brands Fund is up this year by nearly 16%, so outperforming about 96% of its peers, according to our own Bloomberg data. On a 5-year basis, though, it's in the 21st percentile with a return of about 8.4% on average annually. Hey, Eric, nice to have you back with us. This year, though, turning out to be pretty good for you guys. You guys focus on a bunch of names. I think Tim and I always like to ask you, though, big macro, how is it determining those names that you want to focus on?
Well, how are you guys? Nice to talk again. I mean, there's a lot of macro cross currents, isn't there? I mean, between geopolitics and interest rates and the worry about a recession and a consumer that might be tapped out, which I don't agree with. There's a lot to consider. And so when there's a lot to consider, it means volatility is probably going to be higher than normal. And that gives you some opportunities to trade around your core positions. And we're being a little more concentrated in what we own. We're being very laser focused rather than being a little more broad based. And that's helped this year, certainly with some good exposure to the mega cap, let's call them the Magnificent Seven. I don't know who coined that phrase, but that's the one that we're all running with. But 75% of the fund is non-Magnificent Seven, and some of those names are having a great year too, even though the overall market has been a little sluggish, and the average stock is actually flat to down on the year. So it's been a very interesting year indeed.
Now, you guys, in addition to Apple and Amazon, you also have KKR, Live Nation, DraftKings. You also have Microsoft in there, speaking of Magnificent Seven. But I want to go back to something you said, Eric, that you don't agree that the consumer is tapped out. What evidence do you have to show that? Make the case for us, for our listeners, for our viewers.
Yeah, sure. I mean, listen, for 2 years, we've all been overpaying for everything, right? First, we started to do it and we just did it without caring. And then we started to get mad, but we still did it. And for most cases, we're still doing it, but we're finally making choices. And we're doing a lot of trade downs, which is why we love Amazon and a few other, and Costco and a few others. But you know, the consumer, I think some part of the consumer retail is certainly tapped out, because if you're on a fixed budget and everything that you have to buy is going up in price, then of course your discretionary spend, what's left over, isn't as robust, and so you really start making choices and you tighten your belt. But for the most part, there's also $7 trillion in money markets that nobody talks about, and our savings, yes, have been dwindling, but that formula just doesn't take into consideration, you know, your household wealth.
But aren't the people who have the $7 trillion in money markets people at the highest end of the income spectrum anyway?
Well, I think generally speaking, but that, you know, I mean, people in my own family and friends, they've just said, you know, I'm getting zero or less, you know, not much in my savings account at Chase, so I'm going to move that money over to my Schwab brokerage and I'm going to put it in the money market. You know, that how long that sits is anybody's guess, but sentiment is certainly poor. I'm just saying that, you know, as long as people have jobs, then even if we moan and groan about things, you know, listen to what we do, not as much as what we say, because the retail sales numbers have been super strong,
right?
And yet the narrative is that the consumer is tapped out and very, you know, kind of dire.
Eric, I want to ask you, it's something we just talked about with our colleagues over on the TV side on air, and we talked about a call by B of A on their way to play this market, and they say, buy boomers, sell millennials. And basically they're saying, you know, boomers are flush with high interest rates, fattening their savings accounts. Young Americans are struggling with debt, sky-high rents, and mortgage rates that are putting home ownership further out of reach. So
you forgot childcare, Carol.
Yeah, there is that.
There's that too.
So go long
That's why
on
no
old
millennials have money.
people's stocks, and then avoid those whose fortunes ride on cash-strapped millennials. So American Express and cruise ship lines are in. Out is something like Revolve Group, which is a self-styled next-gen fashion retailer. So any of that play into what you are owning in your fund?
Well, sure. Certainly demographics play a big role. I mean, you know, the goal is, if you are a brand that is operating in an important spending category and you appeal to kids all the way up to older adults, and you have global sales opportunities with that demographic, that makes a very interesting setup. But we're certainly focused on the parts of spending where you either have to spend, like going to Costco, or spending using your Visa card and spending on Amazon, or you really want to spend because you've made a choice that this particular product or service is really important. So concerts through Live Nation, they report next week. I think the stock has come down way too far for the stable business that they have. Spotify wouldn't necessarily ring for a baby boomer, but it does. I'm a Gen X. Millennials and Gen Z are fiercely loyal to a Spotify, and they just turned profitable, and they said they're going to stay that way. So we're definitely focused on the demographics of what we have to spend on and what we just absolutely love to spend on. And we do have some Lilly. Lilly's the only healthcare name that we have in there, and that certainly is part of the obesity, the trade, which, you know, is kind of a demographic thing too.
They have their own GLP-1 out of Indiana. What about Nike, down 16.3% this year? Concerns over China, concerns over the consumer. Are those concerns not in the right place?
Well, no, I think China is a concern in general. I think Nike's one of the biggest holdings now because it came down. So we like to add to great businesses when they're on sale. And their latest quarter was really strong. You saw Deckers today with Hoka. Don't bet against Hoka.
I'm wearing them right now.
There you go. The athleisure trade, I think, is Lulu's had a very strong number in their latest report and still has great growth in Asia coming. So I think there's a lot of places to be where the spending category and the brand love is really important. Yeah. And we're ignoring the rest for now.
I know we're running out of time, but from the notes that you shared with our producer, Paul Brennan, you're excited to add on further dips: Apple, Google, Meta, Blackstone, and KKR. Tencent also a favorite. So interesting. Hey, we'll have to